in this case, as always, the autocratic czarist government has proved itself to be a government of irresponsible bureaucrats servilely cringing before the capitalist magnates and nobles. What benefits do the Russian working class and the laboring people generally obtain from the conquests in China? Thousands of ruined families whose breadwinners had been sent to the war, an enormous increase in the national debt and the national expenditure, mounting taxation, greater power for the capitalists, the exploiters of the workers, worse conditions for the workers, still greater mortality among the peasantry, famine in Siberia. This is what the Chinese war promises and is already bringing. The entire Russian press, all the newspapers and periodicals, are kept in a state of bondage. They dare not print anything without permission of the government officials. This is the reason for the lack of precise information as to what the Chinese war is costing the people. But there's no doubt that it requires the expenditure of many hundreds of millions of rubles. It has come to our knowledge that the government, by an unpublished decree, handed out the tidy sum of 150 million rubles for the purpose of waging the war. In addition to this, current expenditures on the war absorb 1 million rubles every 3 or 4 days, and these terrific sums are being squandered by a government which, haggling over every kopeck, has steadily cut down grants to the famine-stricken peasantry, which can find no money for the people's education, which, like any kulak, sweats the workers in the government factories, sweats the lower employees in the post offices, etc. Minister of Finance Witte declared that on January 1st, 1900, there were 250 million rubles available in the treasury. Now, this money is gone. It has been spent on the war. The government is seeking loans, is increasing taxation, is refusing necessary expenditures because of the lack of money, and is putting a stop to the building of railways. The czarist government is threatened with bankruptcy, and yet it is plunging into a policy of conquest, a policy which not only demands the expenditure of enormous sums of money, but threatens to plunge us into still more dangerous wars. The European states that have flung themselves upon Russia are already beginning to quarrel over the division of the booty, and no one can say how this quarrel will end. But the policy of the czarist government in China is not only a mockery of the interests of the people, its aim is to corrupt the political consciousness of the masses. Governments that maintain themselves in power only by means of the bayonet, that have constantly to restrain or suppress the indignation of the people, have long realized the truism that popular discontent can never be removed and that it is necessary to divert the discontent from the government to some other object. For example, hostility is being stirred up against the Jews. The gutter press carries on Jew-baiting campaigns as if the Jewish workers do not suffer in exactly the same way as the Russian workers from the oppression of capital and the police government. At the present time, the press is conducting a campaign against the Chinese. It is howling about the savage yellow race and its hostility towards civilization, about Russia's tasks of enlightenment, about the enthusiasm with which the Russian soldiers go into battle, etc., etc. Journalists who crawl on their bellies before the government and the money bags are straining every nerve to rouse the hatred of the people against China. But the Chinese people have at no time, and in no way, oppressed the Russian people. The Chinese people suffer from the same evils as those from which the Russian people suffer. They suffer from an Asiatic government that squeezes taxes from the starving peasantry and that suppresses every aspiration towards liberty by military force. They suffer from the oppression of capital, which has penetrated into the Middle Kingdom. The Russian working class is beginning to move out of the state of political oppression and ignorance in which the masses of the people are still submerged. Hence, the duty of all class-conscious workers is to rise with all their might against those who are stirring up national hatred and diverting the attention of the working people from their real enemies. The policy of the czarist government in China is a criminal policy, which is impoverishing, corrupting, and oppressing the people more than ever. The czarist government not only keeps our people in slavery, but sends them to pacify other peoples who rebel against their slavery, as was the case in 1849 when Russian troops suppressed the revolution in Hungary. It not only helps the Russian capitalists to exploit the Russian workers, whose hands it ties to hold them back from combining and defending themselves, but it also sends soldiers to plunder other peoples in the interests of a handful of rich men and nobles. There is only one way in which the new burden the war is thrusting upon the working people can be removed, and that is the convening of an assembly of representatives of the people, which would put an end to the autocracy of the government and compel it to have regard for interests other than those solely of a gang of courtiers. And that's the end of the audiobook. So this one's going in a playlist on the channel called Marxism and the National Question and War. There are already a number of texts in that playlist. I'm going to be expanding it fairly dramatically in the next month or two. It seems like with recent events, there is a lot of education that needs to take place on this issue, and I'd like to put out as many resources as possible. I think that the thing that stands out the most to me is this was written in 1900, basically 121 years ago, but how little have the dynamics of capitalism changed in that time? Of course, technology has advanced, and more people have been brought into the proletariat, the dispossessed working class that does not own capital. That has changed, and when I say technology, I mean everything: globalization, communication, transportation technology. It's a much more interconnected world. And indeed, just as the global proletariat has grown and developed due to the demands of capital, so has capital become increasingly international, consolidated, etc. But these basic operations of war and plunder and conquest, the capitalist media lying to the people, trying to incite divisions between people along ethnic or national or whatever lines they can, so that this capitalist can try to gain an advantage over the capitalists over there, or against the relatively underdeveloped country over there. It's all the same. And this is why we study it and apply it in our lives and political struggles today, because the liberation of the working class is an ongoing project as we do this in 2022. Capitalism still needs to be ended. Capitalism still needs to be abolished. Socialism still needs to be built across the whole world. And we need to arm ourselves with as much education as we can as we go out to organize for actually engaging in those fights. I'm going to leave it here. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below. We'll continue the discussion in the comment section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening. And thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. Their financial support has allowed me to spend a lot more time on this channel and has allowed me to produce more content than I would have been able to do without their support. So I thank them. We don't run ads on this channel, as I mentioned in the beginning, so the Patreon is all the financial support that we get. Do consider signing up for $2 a month or more, whatever you see fit. It's much appreciated. Beyond that, other ways to support the channel include engagement, like liking, sharing, subscribing, and leaving a comment, even if it's just thanks or good video. Once the content has been made, it needs to be boosted in that way, and that helps other working people who are looking for answers to questions about what's going on in the world, how to gain power, how to fight back against oppression and exploitation. It helps this content to be more easily stumbled across by those people. So we really appreciate everybody who has become a subscriber and who regularly engages with the channel in those ways. So for now, thanks again, and we will catch you in the next video. M. Kurzizanovsky and others. The newspaper played a decisive role in the struggle for the Marxist Party, in the defeat of the economists, and in the unification of the dispersed social democratic study circles. On the initiative and with the direct participation of Lenin, the editorial board drew up a draft program of the party, published in Iskra number 21, and prepared the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, or RSDLP, which was held in July and August 1903. By the time the Congress was convened, the majority of the local social democratic organizations in Russia had joined forces with Iskra, approved its program, organizational plan, and tactical line, and accepted it as their leading organ. By a special resolution, which righted the exceptional role played by Iskra in the struggle to build the party, the Congress adopted the newspaper as the central organ of the RSDLP and approved an editorial board consisting of Lenin, Plekhanov, and Martov. Despite the decision of the Congress, Martov refused to participate, and numbers 46 to 51 were edited by Lenin and Plekhanov. Later, Plekhanov went over to the Menshevik position and demanded that all the old Menshevik editors, notwithstanding their rejection by the Congress, be placed on the editorial board. Lenin could not agree to this, and on October 19, November 1, New Style, 1903, He left the Iskra editorial board to strengthen his position in the Central Committee, and from there to conduct a struggle against the Menshevik opportunists. Issue number 52 of Iskra was edited by Plekhanov alone. On November 13, 1903, Plekhanov, on his own initiative and in violation of the will of the Congress, co-opted all the old Menshevik editors onto the editorial board. Beginning with issue number 52, the Mensheviks turned Iskra into their own opportunist organ. Comment, we will see Lenin's criticism of this in What Is to Be Done, 1905. Keep in mind this stuff is happening back in 1903 here. Okay, so there are two more footnotes, but one of them is the thing I already read about the student strikes in 1900, 1901, and then the eighth is just another footnote talking about briefly about what is to be done. So that is what.
So, I'm Dan Baker. I'm about to read out loud from What is Marxism by Alan Woods and Rob Sewell. I am on page 138 in the section called Historical Materialism. The chapter is What is Historical Materialism by Alan Woods, 2015. And I'm on the section The Neolithic Revolution. For most of human history, this process has been painfully slow, as The Economist remarked on the eve of the new millennium. For nearly all of human history, economic advance has been so slow as to be imperceptible within the span of a lifetime. For century after century, the annual rate of economic growth was, to one place of decimals, 0. When growth did happen, it was so slow as to be invisible to contemporaries. And even in retrospect, it appears not a rising living standards, which is what growth means today, merely as a gentle rise in population. Down the millennia, progress for all but a tiny elite amounted to this. It slowly became possible for more people to live at the meanest level of subsistence. Human progress began to accelerate with the first great revolution in the productive forces, the transition from the primitive hunter-gatherer mode of production to agriculture. This laid the basis for a settled existence and the rise of the first towns. This was the period Lewis Henry Morgan termed barbarism, that is, the stage between hunter-gatherer society, or quote, savagery, and early class society, when classes begin to form, and with them the state. This decisive turning point, which the archaeologist V. Gordon Childe called the Neolithic Revolution, represented a great leap forward in the development of human productive capacity and therefore culture. This is what Childe has to say. Our debt to pre-literate barbarism is heavy. Every single cultivated food plant of any importance has been discovered by some nameless barbarian society. And that came from Childe, What Happened in History. Agriculture began in the Middle East around 12,000 years ago. The new conditions of production produced a new outlook on life, social relations, and the relations that bind men and women to the natural world and the universe. whose secrets were probed in a way previously undreamt of. The understanding of nature is made necessary by the demands of agriculture, and advances slowly to the degree that men and women actually learn to conquer and subdue the hostile forces of nature in practice through collective labor on a grand scale. The most magnificent examples of this collective labor can be found in the megalithic art of this period, such as Stonehenge, the construction of which involved the transportation of gigantic sarsen stones weighing between 25 and 30 tons over a distance of 20 miles. These, along with other smaller blue stones from as far as West Wales, were meticulously arranged in relation to the solstices. That this impressive feat was achieved using Stone Age technology continues to baffle and amaze archaeologists to this day. And this is only one of many megalithic sites around the world. The Cultural and Religious Revolution referenced the Great Social Revolution, the greatest in all human history till now. That paved the way for the dissolution of the primitive commune and established private property and the means of production. And the means of production are the means of life itself. On the basis of the domestication of plants and animals, permanent villages mushroomed across the region known as the Fertile Crescent. The Neolithic period also saw the growth of the first towns, such as Jericho. Modern Palestine, first dated to 9,500 BC, and Çatalhöyük, modern Turkey, which had an estimated average population of 5,000 to 7,000 people between 7,100 to 5,600 BC. The new mode of production also spread to Europe and South Asia, and arose independently at different times all over the world, including China, Central America, the Andes, and the Sahel. The period of barbarism, which begins with the Neolithic, represents a very large slice of human history and is divided into several more or less distinct periods. In general, it is characterized by the transition from the hunting-gathering mode of production to pastoralism and agriculture, that is, from Paleolithic savagery passing through to the threshold of civilization. In this period, the development of the production forces gave rise to a sustainable surplus for the first time in history, which allowed not only for an expansion of population, but a greater division of labor and an increase in trade between settlements. Here is the embryo, out of which grew great cities, writing, industry, and everything else that laid the basis for what we call civilization. However, this equally laid the basis for the rise of inequality, social classes, and the state. At the most advanced stage of barbarism, the old communal way of life begins to decay, and out of this decay, new class-based institutions begin to arise. This process appears at different times in different places, as early as the 4th millennium BC in Mesopotamia, the 1st millennium BC in the case of Britain, and even later in the case of Vikings. In the Bronze Age and the preceding Chalcolithic or Copper Age, innovations such as irrigation and the ox-drawn cart greatly improved the productivity of agriculture. This, along with the development of metalworking and new tools, such as the potter's wheel and the loom, contributed to an increasingly sophisticated division of labor within settlements, with groups of specialists, craftspeople such as potters. At this stage, a privileged priest or warrior caste began to raise itself above the rest of society and appropriate the bulk of the surplus for itself. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, for example, the priests and temple bureaucrats were freed from menial work and began to develop mathematics and astronomy in order to better direct the production and distribution of the surplus. The introduction of iron weapons and tools represented another revolution in the development of the productive forces. In Iron Age Europe, the growing surplus became an attractive target for raids, leading to continuous warfare between neighboring tribes. Settlements were therefore fortified with huge earthworks, such as Maiden Castle in Dorset and Danebury in Hampshire. Alongside the fortified settlements that characterize this period, we also find the emergence of powerful war leaders or chiefs, and a marked difference in wealth across society. The surplus produced was not reinvested, as there was no way this could be done. Part of the surplus was appropriated by the chief and his family. Part of it was used up in feasting, which occupied a central role in society. In a single feast, as many as 200 to 300 people could be fed. Remains of one such feast, the bones of 12 cows, and a large number of sheep, pigs, and dogs were discovered. These gatherings were not only the occasion for excesses of food and drink, they played an important social and religious role. In such ceremonies, people gave thanks to the gods for the surplus of food. They permitted the mingling of the clans and the settling of communal affairs. Such lavish feasts also provided the chiefs the means by which to display their wealth and power, and thus boost the prestige of the tribe or clan concerned. Another result of warfare was a large number of prisoners of war, many of whom were enslaved and either put to work by their captors or sold like commodities. Sumerian records refer to the use of war captives as slave labor on temple estates. Around 700 BC, Homer would write, "Rather I'd choose laboriously to bear a weight of woes and breath the vital air, a slave to some poor hind that toils for bread, than reign the sceptered monarch of the dead." The growth of movable property and trade encouraged the rise of private property, and with it the concentration of wealth and power into the hands of a minority. This concentration of wealth can be seen in the spectacular individual tombs of the period. The question of inheritance thus began to assume a burning importance. This brought about a dramatic change in the relations between men and women and their offspring. Upon this foundation would eventually rise the first states, special bodies of armed men, as Lenin called them, to defend property and keep the struggle between the newly formed classes within the bounds of order. Here we have the first great instance of alienation. Man's essence is alienated from him in a double or triple sense. First, private property signifies the alienation of his product, which is appropriated by another. Second, his control over his life and destiny is appropriated by the state, in the person of the king or pharaoh. Last but not least, this alienation is carried over from this life on to the next. The inner being, quote, soul, of all men and women is appropriated by the deities of the next world, whose good will must be continually obtained through prayers and sacrifices. Just as the services to the monarch form the basis of the wealth of the upper class of mandarins and nobles, so the sacrifices to the gods form the basis of the wealth and the power of the priest caste that stands between the people and the gods and goddesses. Here we have the genesis of organized religion. The roots of civilization are therefore to be found precisely in barbarism, and still more so in slavery. The development of barbarism tends to end up in slavery, or else in what Marx calls the Asiatic mode of production. However, there have been societies that appear to have retained egalitarian relations at the same time as highly productive agriculture, sophisticated crafts, and cities. The Indus Valley civilization, dated from 3300 to 1300 BC, provides a remarkable example of this phenomenon. The Indus people built large cities, notably Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, both in modern Pakistan, which must have housed tens of thousands, developed specialized and highly skilled craft industries, and traded across long distances. But to this date, archaeologists studying these sites have found no real evidence of temple complexes, palaces, grand monuments, or elaborate tombs, like those of the Egyptian pharaohs. This evidence powerfully suggests that the emergence of exploited and exploiting classes and the state had not taken place, or was at most a very early stage of development. Fascinating sites like Mohenjo-daro provide an insight into the wealth of transitional and hybrid societies, which must have appeared over the thousands of years between the origin of agriculture and the first states. But class societies would eventually come to dominate. The Indus Valley Civilization finally entered into decline from around 1900 BC. By 1700 BC, cities had completely disappeared from the region and would eventually be replaced by the highly unequal society depicted in the Hindu Rig Veda. The emergence of class society resulted in the subjection of the majority by a minority. But on the broad scales of history, it was a revolutionary phenomenon in that it freed a privileged section of the population, a ruling class, from the direct burden of labor, permitting it in the necessary time to develop art, science, and culture. Class society, despite its ruthless exploitation and inequality, was the road that humankind needed to travel if it was to build up the necessary material prerequisites for a future classless society. The Asiatic mode of production. The really explosive growth of civilization occurs with Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, China, Mexico, and Peru. In other words, the development of class society coincides with a massive upturn in the productive forces. And as a result of human culture, which reached unprecedented heights, in southern Mesopotamia, the Sumerians built Lagash, Eridu, and other city-states. They were a literate people who left behind thousands of clay tablets written in cuneiform script. The main features of the Asiatic mode of production are 1. An urban society with an agrarian base. 2. A primarily agricultural economy. 3. Public works, which are frequently but not always identified with the need for irrigation and the upkeep and spread of intensive canal and drainage systems. 4. A despotic system of government, often with a god king at the top. 5. A large bureaucracy. 6. A system of exploitation based on taxation. And 7. Common state ownership of the land. Although slavery existed, prisoners of war, these were not actually slave societies. Oops. There is an element of coercion, but the main thing is habit, tradition, and religion. The community serves the god king or queen. It serves the temple, for example, Israel. This is associated with the state and is the state. The origins of the state are here mixed up with religion, and this religious aura is maintained to the present. People are taught to look up to the state with feelings of awe and reverence as a force standing above society, above ordinary men and women who must serve it blindly. The village commune, the basic cell of these societies, is almost entirely self-sufficient. The few luxuries accessible to a population of subsistence farmers are obtained from the bazaar or from traveling peddlers who live on the margins of society. Money is scarcely known. Taxes to the state are paid in kind. There is no connection between one village and another, and internal trade is weak. The real cohesion comes from the state. There was an almost total lack of social mobility, reinforced in some cases by the caste system. The emphasis is on the group rather than the individual. Endogamous marriage prevails. That is, people tend to marry strictly within their class or caste. Economically, they tend to follow the professions of their parents. In the Hindu caste system, this is in fact obligatory. This fact of mobility and social rigidity helps to tie the people to the land, the village commune. As examples of this kind of society, we have the Egyptians, Babylonians, Assyrians, and the Shang or Yin dynasty, traditionally dating from about 1766 to 1122 BC. In an entirely separate development, the pre-Hispanic civilizations of Mexico and Peru, though with certain variations, display strikingly similar features. The tax system and other methods of exploitation, such as obligatory labor service for the state, corvée, is oppressive, but accepted as inevitable and the natural order of things, sanctioned by tradition and religion. Corvée is unfree labor, often unpaid, that is imposed on the people, either by an aristocratic landowner, as in feudalism, or, as in this case, by the state. But whereas the corvée system is similar to that which is found in Western feudalism, the system of land ownership is not at all the same. In fact, the British rulers of India had the greatest difficulty making sense of it. Where towns and cities sprang up, it is usually along trade routes, and on the banks of rivers, an oasis, or other main sources of water. The towns are the administrative and commercial centers for the villages. Here are traders and artisans, ironworkers, carpenters, weavers, dyers, shoemakers, masons, etc. Here also are the local representatives of the state power, the only ones with which the mass of the population are familiar, low-grade civil servants, scribes, and police or soldiers. There are also moneylenders, charging usurious rates to the peasants who are fleeced in turn by the tax collector, the merchant, and the village usurer. Many of these ancient elements have survived until modern times, in some countries of the Middle East and Asia. There are payday advance people here that do the same thing. But the advent of colonialism destroyed the ancient Asiatic modes of production once and for all. It was, in any case, a historical dead end from which no further development was possible. In these societies, the mental horizons of people are extremely limited. The most powerful force in people's lives is the family or the clan, which educates them and teaches them about their history, religion, and traditions. About politics and the world at large, they know little or nothing. Their only contact with the state is the village headman, who is responsible for collecting taxes. What strikes one about these early civilizations is on the one hand their longevity, on the other, the slow development of the productive forces and the extremely conservative nature of their outlook. This was an essentially static mode of society. The only changes were the result of periodic invasions by the nomadic barbarians of the steppes, the Mongols, for example, or occasional peasant revolts, such as in China, that led to a change of dynasty. However, the substitution of one dynasty for another does not signify any real change. The social relations in the state remain untouched by all the changes at the top. The end result was always the same. The invaders were absorbed and the system continued, undisturbed as before. Empires rose and fell. There was a continuous process of fusion and fission. But through all these political and military changes, nothing fundamentally changed for the peasantry at the bottom. Life continued its seemingly eternal and quote-unquote divinely ordained routine. The Asiatic idea of a never-ending cycle in religion is a reflection of this state of affairs. At the bottom we had the ancient village commune, based on subsistence agriculture that had survived virtually unchanged for millennia. Being predominantly agricultural, the rhythm of their lives is dominated by the eternal cycle of the seasons, for example, the annual flooding of the Nile. In recent years, there has been a lot of noise in certain intellectual and quasi-Marxist circles about the Asiatic modes of production, But although Marx mentioned it, he did so only rarely and usually as an aside. He never developed it, which he certainly would have done if he had considered it important. The reason he did not do so was because it was a historical dead end, compared to the Neanderthals in human evolution. It was a form of society which, despite achievements, ultimately did not contain within itself the seeds of future development. These were planted elsewhere, on the soil of Greece and Rome. Greek society was formed under different conditions to those of earlier civilizations. Slavery. In small city-states of Greece lacked the vast expanses of cultivable land, the great plains of the Nile or Indus Valley in Mesopotamia. Hemmed in by barren mountain ranges, they faced the sea, and this fact determined their whole course of development. Ill-suited both to agriculture or industry, they were pushed in the direction of the sea, becoming a trading nation and an intermediary, as the Phoenicians had done earlier. Ancient Greece has a different socioeconomic structure, and consequently a different spirit and a different outlook to the earlier societies of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Hegel says that in the East, the ruling spirit was freedom for the one, i.e., for the ruler, the god king, but under Athenian democracy, it was freedom for the many, that is to say, freedom for the citizens of Athens who did not happen to be slaves. But the slaves who did most of the work had no rights at all. Neither did foreigners, who for the most part were citizens of other city-states, nor women. For the free citizens, Athens was a most advanced democracy. This new spirit, infused with humanity and individualism, affected Greek art, religion, and philosophy, which are qualitatively different from that of Egypt and Mesopotamia. When Athens was mistress of all Greece, she had only a minimal system of taxation. This was completely different to the Asiatic system in Persia and other earlier civilizations. But this was all based ultimately on the labor of the slaves, who were private property. The main division was between free men and slaves. The free citizens did not usually pay taxes, which were regarded as degrading, as was manual labor. There was also a bitter class struggle in Greek society, characterized by a sharp division within the free population based on property. The slaves, as chattel that could be bought and sold, were treated as means of production. In ancient Rome, where slavery developed even further, a slave was known as an instrumentum vocale, a tool with a voice. That puts it very clearly. And despite all the changes in the last 2,000 years, the real position of the modern wage slave has not fundamentally changed since then. It may be objected that Greece and Rome stood on the basis of slavery, which is an abhorrent and inhuman institution, but Marxists cannot look at history from the point of view of morality. Apart from anything else, there is no such thing as a superhistorical morality. Every society has its own morality, religion, culture, etc., which corresponded to a given level of development, and at least in the period we call civilization, also to the interests of a particular class. Whether a particular war was good, bad, or indifferent cannot be ascertained from the point of view of the number of victims, much less from an abstract moral standpoint. We may strongly disapprove of wars in general, but one thing cannot be denied. Throughout the whole course of human history, all serious questions have ultimately been settled in this way. That goes for both the conflicts between nations, wars, and the conflicts between classes, revolutions. Our attitude towards a particular type of society and its culture cannot be determined by moralistic considerations. What determines whether a given socioeconomic formation is historically progressive or not is first and foremost its ability to develop the productive forces, the real material basis upon which all human culture arises and develops. Hegel, that wonderfully profound thinker, writes, It was not so much from slavery as through slavery that humanity was emancipated. Despite its monstrously oppressive character, slavery marked a step forward, inasmuch as it permitted a further development of the production power of society. We owe all the wonderful achievements of modern science to Greece and Rome, that is to say, ultimately, to the labor of the slaves. The Romans utilized brute force to subjugate other peoples, sold entire cities into slavery, slaughtered thousands of prisoners of war for amusement in the public circus, and introduced such refined methods of execution as crucifixion. Yet, all that is perfectly true. To us it seems such a monstrous aberration, and yet when we come to consider where all our modern civilization, our culture, our literature, our architecture, our medicine, our science, our philosophy, even in many cases our language, comes from, the answer is from Greece and Rome. Decline of slave society. Slavery contains an inner contradiction that led us to its destruction. Although the labor of the individual slave was not very productive, slave must be compelled to work. The aggregate of large numbers of slaves, as in the mines and the latifundia, large-scale agricultural units, in Rome, in the last period of the Republic and the Empire, produced a considerable surplus. At the height of the Empire, slaves were plentiful and cheap, and the wars of Rome were basically slave hunts on a massive scale. But at a certain stage, this system reached its limit, and then entered into a lengthy period of decline. Since slave labor is only productive when it is employed on a massive scale, the prior condition for its success is an ample supply of slaves at a low cost. But slaves breed very slowly in captivity, and so the only way a sufficient supply of slaves can be guaranteed is through continuous warfare. Once the empire had reached the limits of its expansion under Hadrian, this became increasingly difficult. The beginnings of a crisis in Rome can already be observed in the latter period of the Republic, a period characterized by acute beginnings. There was a violent struggle. A period characterized by acute social and political upheavals and class war. From the earliest beginnings, there was a violent struggle between rich and poor in Rome. There are detailed accounts in the writings of Livy and other of the struggles between the plebeians and patricians, which ended in an uneasy compromise. At a latter period, when Rome had already made herself mistress of the Mediterranean by the defeat of her most powerful rival, Carthage, we saw what was really a struggle for the division of spoils. Tiberius Gracchus demanded that the wealth of Rome be divided up among its free citizens. His aim was to make Italy a republic of small farmers and not slaves, but he was defeated by the nobles and slaveholders. This was a disaster for Rome in the long run. The ruined peasantry, the backbone of the republic and its army, drifted to Rome, where they constituted a lumpen proletariat, a non-productive class living off dole from the state. Although resentful of the rich, they nevertheless carried a common interest in the exploitation of the slaves, the only really productive class in the period of the Republic and the Empire. The great slave rising under Spartacus was a glorious episode in the history of antiquity. The spectacle of these most downtrodden people rising up with arms in hand and inflicting defeat after defeat on the armies of the world's greatest power is one of the most incredible events in history. Had they succeeded in overthrowing the Roman state, the course of history would have been significantly altered. The basic reason why Spartacus failed in the end was the fact that the slaves did not link up with the proletariat in the towns. So long as the latter continued to support the state, the victory of the slaves was impossible. However, the Roman proletariat, unlike the modern proletariat, was not a productive class but purely a parasitical one, living off the labor of the slaves and dependent on their masters. The failure of the Roman Revolution is rooted in this fact. The defeat of the slaves led straight to the ruin of the Roman state. and the absence of a free peasantry. The state was obliged to rely on a mercenary army to fight its wars. The deadlock in the class struggle produced a situation similar to the more modern phenomenon of Bonapartism. The Roman equivalent is what we call Caesarism. An interesting note, the USA uses a lot of mercenaries and also recently opened a completely foreign military base in the United States. The Roman legionnaire was no longer loyal to the Republic but to his commander, the man who guaranteed his pay, his loot, and his plot of land when he retired. The last period of the Republic is characterized by an intensification of the struggle between the classes, in which neither side is able to win a decisive victory. As a result, the state, which Lenin described as armed bodies of men, began to acquire increasing independence, to raise itself above society, and to appear as the final arbiter in the continuing power struggles in Rome. A whole series of military adventurers appear: Marius, Crassus, Pompey, and lastly Julius Caesar, a general of brilliance, a clever politician and a shrewd businessman who in effect put an end to the Republic while paying lip service to it. With his prestige boosted by his military triumphs in Gaul, Spain, and Britain, he began to concentrate all power in his hands. Although he was assassinated by a conservative faction who wished to preserve the Republic, led by Brutus and Cassius, the old regime was doomed. After Brutus and the others were defeated by the Second Triumvirate, the Republic was formally recognized, and this pretense was kept up by the first emperor, Augustus. The very title emperor, imperator, in Latin, is a military title, invented to avoid the title of king that was so offensive to Republican ears. But a king he was, in all but name. The forms of the old Republic survived for a long time after that, but they were just that, hollow forms with no real content, an empty husk that in the end could be blown away by the wind. The Senate was devoid of all real power and authority. Julius Caesar had shocked respectable public opinion by making a Gaul a member of the Senate. Caligula considerably improved upon this by making his horse a senator. Nobody saw anything wrong with this, or if they did, they kept their mouths firmly shut. It often happens in history that outsworn institutions can survive long after their reasons to exist have disappeared. They drag out a miserable existence like a decrepit old man who clings on to life until they are swept away by a revolution. The decline of the Roman Empire lasted for centuries. This was not an uninterrupted process. There were periods of recovery and even brilliance, but the general line was downwards. In periods like this, there is a general sense of malaise. The predominant mood is one of skepticism, lack of faith, and pessimism in the future. The old traditions, morality, and religions, things that act as powerful cement holding society together, lose their credibility. In place of the old religion, people seek out new gods. In its period of decline, Rome was inundated with a plague of religious sects from the East. Christianity was only one of these, and although ultimately successful, it had to contend with numerous rivals, such as the cult of Mithras. When people feel that the world in which they are living is tottering, and they have lost all control over their existence, and that their lives and destinies are determined by unseen forces, then mystical and irrational tendencies get the upper hand. People believe that the end of the world is nigh. The early Christians believed this fervently, but many others suspected it. In point of fact, what was coming to an end was not the world, but only a particular form of society, slave society. The success of Christianity was rooted in the fact that it connected with this general mood. The world was evil and sinful. It was necessary to turn one's back on the world and all its works, and look forward to another life after death. I'm going to wrap it up here with the reading and start the yoga and meditation here. But as socialists, as communists, we firmly believe, well, we know that religions are all mythologies. There is no God or anything like that. So I'm going to put Lenin back on, and we will listen to that while we sit and meditate on what we just read. And please like, share, and subscribe. Check out communistusa.org/join. And join the Revolutionary Communists of America. Oh, I'm kind of ghastly in this light. So we are going to listen to Where to Begin while we meditate and do yoga.
That is where to begin. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. Today's date is November 25, 2020. If you're in the U.S., it's the day before Thanksgiving, and if you're not, I guess it isn't. Today's audiobook is Where to Begin by Lenin. This is from May 1901. I have been teasing what is to be done for a while on the channel. I've just been busy with other things in my life, and it's a really long PDF, like 130 pages, so it's just been taking a while. In the meantime, I'm uploading this. This is kind of a forerunner predecessor to 1905's What is to be Done. Again, May 1901. So this is a short one. It has a lot of notes. I'm going to be reading the notes in this one because the text itself, it's short and the notes are almost as long as the text. Also, for just people trying to understand what happened in Russia in the early 1900s, first 2 decades leading up to the Revolution and Civil War, people have been talking a lot about the massive unrest in the United States right now. Right now, the United States has a third of recorded active cases in the entire world. And no, the US doesn't have a third of the world's population, not by far. So there is a massive society-wide problem. Almost everyone in the society recognizes the problem. All we really need is organization. And breaking free of the Democratic Party, breaking free of sort of the illusion of electoralism. I've promoted voting on this channel, but kind of just as a protest vote. I don't seriously think anyone's going to vote in socialism. And, I've seen people debating whether it even makes sense for ML parties or socialist parties to run candidates because it just kind of validates the illusion and can be confusing to people. I can see that point of view too. Who knows? I may adopt that point of view at some point because honestly, the shit I see coming out of Twitter and stuff, it's like people are still so invested in that system. It's crazy. But for understanding where to begin and the situation in Russia in 1900, 1901, that revolution didn't come out of a vacuum. There was a buildup, just like there is a buildup to something happening in the United States right now. It's crazy, crazy, crazy breakdown. And for anyone not in the United States who doesn't know, basically the U.S. government wrote working families like I think a $1,200 check per person, and I think if you had a child, it was like $500 extra per child, and that was it. And that was months ago. People were more eligible for unemployment insurance, even people who weren't normally eligible for unemployment benefits, as a result of some pandemic relief. But for most people, they've been only paying like $175 or $200 a week through those benefits. There were enhanced benefits over the summer, but they ran out July 31st. And since August, people have just been expected to live off that $175, $200 or go to work. It's a really, really crazy situation. I, for one, I've been working on different projects this year. It is, including Socialism for All, obviously. It is hard for me to just stay motivated and to sit in my studio and not just be like pacing madly, or it's just, it's really, really disconcerting what's going on. We're now in the winter, or coming into the winter, it's still the fall, but crazy, crazy economic instability. And the government just went on holiday again. They went on vacation. They're just giving everyone a giant middle finger it's Thanksgiving. There's food bank lines everywhere. If you're listening to this and you're struggling, my heart goes out to you. I don't know what to say except look for like a mutual aid network in your area. You might be able to be connected with some resources. It's insanity. So anyway, on that note, getting back to Lenin's Where to Begin, before we get into that, linked off of the text, this is kind of a short one, and I'll be reading the footnotes in this because the footnotes are about as long as the text. Also, there's a reference here to the student strikes of 1900 and 1901, and I just wanted to read that first to set the scene. So this is an entry from the Encyclopedia of Marxism at Marxists.org. Mass revolutionary actions of students and workers, political demonstrations, meetings, strikes that took place in February and March 1901 in St. Petersburg, Moscow, Kiev, Kharkov, Kazan, Yaroslavl, Warsaw, Belostok, Tomsk, Odessa, and other cities in Russia. The student movement of 1900 to 1901, which began with academic demands, acquired the character of revolutionary action against the reactionary policy of the autocracy. It was supported by the advanced workers, and it met with a response among all strata of Russian society. The direct cause of the demonstrations and strikes in February and March 1901 was the drafting of the 183 Kiev University students into the army as a punitive act for their participation in a students' meeting. The government launched a furious attack on participants in the revolutionary actions. The police and the Cossacks dispersed demonstrations and assaulted the participants. Hundreds of students were arrested and expelled from colleges and universities. On March 4, 1901, the demonstration in the square in front of the Kazan Cathedral in St. Petersburg was dispersed with particular brutality. The February-March events were evidence of the revolutionary upsurge in Russia. The mass participation of workers in the movement was of tremendous importance. So that is just a little bit of background here as things were starting to heat up in Russia. But again, we're still, over 15 years away at this point from the revolution and the Civil War. So is the situation in the U.S. comparable? I'll just give you this before we get into where to begin. I mean, we have had in the past in the United States uprisings. I mean, there was Occupy, which is fairly well behaved. There's been race riots like Newark, Detroit, LA. I don't think ever, though, before have there been simultaneous uprisings in dozens of cities across the country as we've seen in 2020. Things are falling apart with U.S. capitalism. The ruling class went into a really desperate tactic since George W. Bush, 9/11, the war on terror. Basically, that whole push to like remilitarize society and go on a global raid of militarism abroad, austerity at home, police state at home, surveillance state at home. That whole push was like a pretty desperate attempt to keep the U.S. dominant. And we're now 20 years into that. And it's falling apart. It's not working. They're just using more and more brute force. More and more people, this year especially, have turned out to peaceful protest, whether it was for racial justice or foreclosures or like whatever the particular cause that somebody might have turned out to a demo for. I think a lot of people this year got radicalized by the experience of like what they actually witnessed out there. So this is happening. I've been using the hashtag Revolution2030 to describe if we on the far left push really, really hard, we may have a moment by or, like at or before 2030. Things are changing so rapidly. It's very hard to predict anything. What I can say is if we on the Marxist left lean in hard, we've seen other movements, the Social Democrats in the 2010s, the Libertarians in the 2000s, do that for about a decade and then get kind of a moment, whether it's Bernie Sanders for the Social Democrats, in the squad, not really useful to us as socialists. It's very, very limited. Or the Libertarians with the Tea Party, obviously that's not even like relevant as a socialist endeavor. Those are people propped up by billionaires, horrible right-wing reactionaries. But the point is that those movements had moments I think we could have a moment too, and not a moment too soon, because things are falling apart. People are getting radicalized. Joe Biden's coming in, and already his cabinet that he's been appointing is like crazy militarists. He appointed the woman who did I forget what her post is, and I forget, Avril something. She's the person who, when the Senate torture report was coming out, CIA people who didn't want it coming out hacked Senate emails, which is obviously hugely illegal. And then the CIA even recommended that they be prosecuted. This woman stepped in and said, don't prosecute the CIA agents who hacked Senate emails to try to interfere with the torture report coming out. So that's who Joe Biden is. That's what we're getting more of. Joe Biden tweeted recently, America is back. Well, I don't fucking want it. So anyway, let's go back to a revolutionary moment in another country to try to see if we can get some inspiration, some historical lessons, etc. Okay, so this is Vladimir Lenin's Where to Begin, written May 1901, published in Iskra. Number 4, May 1901, published according to the Iskra text. The source is Lenin Collected Works by the Foreign Languages Publishing House, 1961, Moscow, Volume 5, pages 13 to 24. Transcription and markup was by R. Simbala, and this is in the public domain, Lenin Internet Archive, hosted by the Marxists Internet Archive, marxists.org. Please go check out their stuff. Support them if you can. They have put thousands of Marxist works from all eras up online for free. All right, beginning the audiobook. In recent years, the question of what is to be done has confronted Russian social democrats with particular insistence. It is not a question of what path we must choose, as was the case in the late 80s and early 90s, but of what practical steps we must take upon the known path and how they shall be taken. It is a question of a system and plan of practical work, and it must be admitted that we have not yet solved this question of the character and the methods of struggle, fundamental for a party of practical activity, that it still gives rise to serious differences of opinion which reveal a deplorable ideological instability and vacillation. On the one hand, the economist trend, far from being dead, is endeavoring to clip and narrow the work of political organization and agitation. On the other, unprincipled eclecticism is again rearing its head, aping every new trend, and is incapable of distinguishing immediate demands from the main tasks and permanent needs of the movement as a whole. This trend, as we know, has ensconced itself in Рабочее дело, another publication. This journal's latest statement of program, a bombastic article under the bombastic title, A Historic Turn, or Listock, bears out with special emphasis the characterization we have given. Only yesterday there was a flirtation with economism, a fury over the resolute condemnation of Рабочая мысль, and Plekhanov's presentation of the question of the struggle against autocracy was being toned down. But today, Liebknecht's words are being quoted, quote, if the circumstances change within 24 hours, then tactics must be changed within 24 hours, unquote. There is talk of a, quote, strong fighting organization for direct attack, for storming the autocracy, of, quote, broad revolutionary political agitation among the masses, unquote. How energetic we are now, both revolutionary and political, of, quote, ceaseless calls for street protests, of, quote, street demonstrations of a pronounced political character, unquote, and so on and so forth. We might perhaps declare ourselves happy at Рабочее дело's quick grasp of the program we put forward in the first issue of Iskra, calling for the formation of a strong, well-organized party whose aim is not only to win isolated concessions, but to storm the fortress of the autocracy itself. But the lack of any set point of view in these individuals can only dampen our happiness. Рабочее дело, of course, mentions Liebknecht's name in vain. The tactics of agitation in relation to some special question, or the tactics with regard to some detail of party organization, may be changed in 24 hours, but only people devoid of all principle are capable of changing in 24 hours, or for that matter in 24 months, their view on the necessity, in general, constantly, and absolutely, of an organization of struggle and of political agitation among the masses. It is ridiculous to plead different circumstances and a change of periods. The building of a fighting organization and the conduct of political agitation are essential under any drab, peaceful circumstances, in any period, no matter how marked by a, quote, declining revolutionary spirit. Moreover, it is precisely in such periods and under such circumstances that this kind of work is particularly necessary, since it is too late to form the organization in times of explosion and outbursts. The party must be in a state of readiness to launch activity at a moment's notice. Quote, change the tactics within 24 hours. But in order to change tactics, it is first necessary to have tactics. Without a strong organization skilled in waging political struggle under all circumstances and at all times, there can be no question of that systematic plan of action, illumined by firm principles and steadfastly carried out, which alone is worthy of the name of tactics. Let us indeed consider the matter. We are now being told that the, quote, historic moment has presented our party with a, quote, completely new question, the question of terror. Yesterday, the, quote, completely new question was political organization and agitation. Today, it is terror. Is it not strange to hear people who have so grossly forgotten their principles holding forth on a radical change in tactics? Unfortunately, Robochia Diallo is in error. The question of terror is not a new question at all. It will suffice to recall the briefly established views of the Russian social democracy on the subject. In principle, we have never rejected and cannot reject terror. Terror is one of the forms of military action that may be perfectly suitable and even essential at a definite juncture in the battle, given a definite state of the troops and the existence of definite conditions. But the important point is that terror, at the present time, is by no means suggested as an operation for the army in the field, an operation closely connected with and integrated into the entire system of struggle, but as an independent form of occasional attack unrelated to any army, without a central body, and with the weakness of local revolutionary organizations. This, in fact, is all that terror can be. We therefore declare emphatically that under the present conditions, such a means of struggle is inopportune and unsuitable, that it diverts the most active fighters from their real task, the task which is most important from the standpoint of the interests of the movement as a whole, and that it disorganizes the forces not of the government but of the revolution. We need but recall the recent events. With our own eyes, we saw that the mass of workers and, quote, common people of the towns pressed forward in struggle while the revolutionaries lacked a staff of leaders and organizers. Under such conditions, is there not the danger that, as the most energetic revolutionaries go over to terror, the fighting contingents, in whom alone it is possible to place serious reliance, will be weakened? Is there not the danger of rupturing the contact between the revolutionary organizations and the disunited masses of the discontented, the protesting, and the disposed to struggle, who are weak precisely because they are disunited? Yet it is this contact that is the sole guarantee of our success. Far be it from us to deny the significance of heroic individual blows, but it is our duty to sound a vigorous warning against becoming infatuated with terror, against taking it to be the chief and basic means of struggle, as so many people strongly inclined to do at present. Terror can never be a regular military operation. At best, it can only serve as one of the methods employed in a decisive assault. But can we issue the call for such a decisive assault at the present moment? Robochia Diallo apparently thinks we can. At any rate, it exclaims, form assault columns. But this again is more zeal than reason. The main body of our military forces consists of volunteers and insurgents. We possess only a few small units of regular troops, and these are not even mobilized. They are not connected with one another, nor have they been trained to form columns of any sort, let alone assault columns. In view of all this, it must be clear to anyone who is capable of appreciating the general conditions of our struggle, and who is mindful of them at every turn in the historical course of events, that at the present moment our slogan cannot be to the assault, but has to be lay siege to the enemy fortress. In other words, the immediate task of our party is not to summon all available forces for the attack right now, but to call for the formation of a revolutionary organization capable of uniting all forces and guiding the movement in actual practice, and not in name alone, That is, an organization ready at any time to support every protest and every outbreak and use it to build up and consolidate the fighting forces suitable for the decisive struggle. The lesson of the February and March events, comment, in other words, the student protests that I was reading about, has been so impressive that no disagreement in principle with this conclusion is now likely to be encountered. What we need at the present moment, however, is not a solution of the problem in principle, but a practical solution. We should not only be clear on the nature of the organization that is needed and its precise purpose, but we must elaborate a definite plan for an organization so that its formation may be undertaken from all aspects. In view of the pressing importance of the question, we, on our part, take the liberty of submitting to the comrades a skeleton plan to be developed in greater detail in a pamphlet now in preparation for print. Comment, that pamphlet is What is to be Done of 1905. In our opinion, the starting point of our activities, the first step toward creating the desired organization, or let us say the main thread which, if followed, would enable us steadily to develop, deepen, and extend that organization, should be the founding of an all-Russian political newspaper. A newspaper is what we most of all need. Without it, we cannot conduct that systematic all-round propaganda and agitation consistent in principle, which is the chief and permanent task of social democracy in general, and in particular the pressing task of the moment when interest in politics and in questions of socialism has been aroused among the broadest strata of the population. Never has the need been felt so acutely as today for reinforcing dispersed agitation in the form of individual action, local leaflets, pamphlets, etc., by means of generalized and systematic agitation that can only be conducted with the aid of the periodical press. It may be said without exaggeration that the frequency and regularity with which a newspaper is printed and distributed can serve as a precise criterion of how well this cardinal and most essential sector of our militant activities is built up. Furthermore, our newspaper must be all Russian. If we fail, and as long as we fail, to combine our efforts to influence the people and the government by means of the printed word, it will be utopian to think of combining other means, more complex, more difficult, but also more decisive for exerting influence. Our movement suffers in the first place ideologically, as well as in practical and organizational respects, from its state of fragmentation, from the almost complete immersion of the overwhelming majority of social democrats in local work, which narrows their outlook, the scope of their activities, and their skill in the maintenance of secrecy and their preparedness. It is precisely in this state of fragmentation that one must look for the deepest roots of the instability and the waverings noted above. The first step towards eliminating this shortcoming, towards transforming diverse local movements into a single, all-Russian movement, must be the founding of an all-Russian newspaper. Lastly, what we need is definitely a political newspaper. Without a political organ, a political movement deserving that name is inconceivable in the Europe of today. Without such a newspaper, we cannot possibly fulfill our task, that of concentrating all the elements of political discontent and protest, of vitalizing thereby the revolutionary movement of the proletariat. We have taken the first step. We have aroused in the working class a passion for economic, factory exposures. We must now take the next step, that of arousing in every section of the population that is at all politically conscious a passion for political exposure. We must not be discouraged by the fact that the voice of political exposure is today so feeble, timid, and infrequent. This is not because of a wholesale submission to police despotism, but because those who are able and ready to make exposures have no tribune from which to speak, no eager and encouraging audience. They do not see anywhere among the people that force to which it would be worthwhile directing their complaint against the, quote, omnipotent Russian government. But today, all this is rapidly changing. There is such a force. It is the revolutionary proletariat, which has demonstrated its readiness not only to listen to and support the summons to political struggle, but to boldly engage in battle. We are now in a position to provide a tribune for the nationwide exposure of the Tsarist government, and it is our duty to do this. That tribune must be a social democratic newspaper. The Russian working class, as distinct from the other classes and strata of Russian society, displays a constant interest in political knowledge, and manifests a constant and extensive demand, not only in periods of intensive unrest, for illegal literature. When such a mass demand is evident, when the training of experienced revolutionary leaders has already begun, and when the concentration of the working class makes it virtual master in the working class districts of the big cities and in the factory settlements and communities, it is quite feasible for the proletariat to found a political newspaper. Through the proletariat, the newspaper will reach the urban petty bourgeoisie, the rural handicraftsmen, and the peasants, thereby becoming a real people's political newspaper. Just a quick comment and side note. When Lenin says social democracy here, or social democrats, he's not talking about the reform capitalists of today. That was the name of the socialist communist movement in those days, so just so you're not confused by that. The role of a newspaper, however, is not limited solely to the dissemination of ideas, to political education, and to the enlistment of political allies. A newspaper is not only a collective propagandist and a collective agitator, it is also a collective organizer. In this last respect, it may be likened to the scaffolding round a building under construction, which marks the contours of the structure and facilitates communication between the builders, enabling them to distribute the work and to view the common results achieved by their organized labor. With the aid of the newspaper and through it, a permanent organization will naturally take shape that will engage not only in local activities but in regular general work, and will train its members to follow political events carefully, appraise their significance and their effect on the various strata of the population, and develop effective means for the Revolutionary Party to influence these events. The mere technical task of regularly supplying the newspaper with copy and of promoting regular distribution will necessitate a network of local agents of the United Party who will maintain constant contact with one another, know the general state of affairs, get accustomed to performing regularly their detailed functions in the all-Russian work, and test their strength in the organization of various revolutionary actions. This network of agents will form the skeleton of precisely the kind of organization we need, one that is sufficiently large to embrace the whole country, sufficiently broad and many-sided to effect a strict and detailed division of labor, sufficiently well-tempered to be able to conduct steadily its own work under any circumstances, at all, quote, sudden turns, and in face of all contingencies, sufficiently flexible to be able, on the one hand, to avoid an open battle against an overwhelming enemy, when the enemy has concentrated all his forces on one spot, and yet, on the other, to take advantage of his unwieldiness and to attack him when and where he least expects it. Today we are faced with the relatively easy task of supporting student demonstrations in the streets of big cities. Tomorrow we may, perhaps, have the more difficult task of supporting, for example, the unemployed movement in some particular area, and the day after to be at our posts in order to play a revolutionary part in a peasant uprising. Today, we must take advantage of the tense political situation arising out of the government's campaign against the Zemstvo. Tomorrow, we may have to support popular indignation against some czarist Bashi Bazouk on the rampage and help, by means of boycott, indictment, demonstrations, etc., to make things so hot for him as to force him into open retreat. Such a degree of combat readiness can be developed only through the constant activity of regular troops. If we join forces to produce a common newspaper, this work will train and bring into the foreground not only the most skillful propagandists, but the most capable organizers, the most talented political party leaders capable, at the right moment, of releasing the slogan for the decisive struggle and of taking the lead in that struggle. In conclusion, a few words to avoid possible misunderstanding. We have spoken continuously of systematic, planned preparation, yet it is by no means our intention to imply that the autocracy can be overthrown only by a regular siege or by organized assault. Such a view would be absurd and doctrinaire. On the contrary, it is quite possible, and historically more probable, that the autocracy will collapse under the impact of one of the spontaneous outbursts or unforeseen political complications which constantly threaten it from all sides. But no political party that wishes to avoid adventurous gambles can base its activities on the anticipation of such outbursts and complications. We must go our own way, and we must steadfastly carry on our regular work. And the less our reliance on the unexpected, the less the chance of our being caught unawares by any, quote, historic turns. So that's the end of the text. And as I mentioned, I'm going to go through the notes, and then I'm also going to have some closing comments before we wrap this up. Okay, so the first footnote, this is in reference to when he is talking about the network of agents who will form the skeleton of the kind of organization that they need to embrace the whole country, having many different positive attributes. So Lenin writes, "It will be understood, of course, that these agents could work successfully only in the closest contact with the local committees, groups, study circles of our party. In other words, they wouldn't be lone wolves. In general, the entire plan we project can, of course, be implemented only with the most active support of the committees which have on repeated occasions attempted to unite the party, and which, we are sure, will achieve this unification. If not today, then tomorrow. If not in one way, then another." So the second footnote concerns the section, this is actually just on the title itself. So Where to Begin was published in Iskra and reissued by local social democratic organizations as a separate pamphlet. The Siberian Social Democratic League printed 5,000 copies of the pamphlet and distributed it throughout Siberia. The pamphlet was also distributed in Samara, Tambov, Nizhny Novgorod, and other Russian cities. The third footnote is on Рабочее дело, when Lenin is talking about the unwelcome trends that he was seeing in Рабочее дело. So Рабочее дело, or the workers' cause, a journal with economist views, comment. So economism is the idea, Lenin would basically call this trade union consciousness later. It's the idea of workers just focusing on, better pay, better scheduling, better conditions, things like that, without any kind of revolutionary cause, or that just focusing on that would somehow lead to revolution. But in other words, it's the idea of just putting that first. And it's been widely, derided by Marxist revolutionaries forever. This was kind of the time period when that was really put on the record the most. So Рабочее дело, a journal with economist views, organ of the Union of Russian Social Democrats Abroad. It appeared irregularly and was published in Geneva from April 1899 to February 1902 under the editorship of B.N. Khrushchevsky, A.S. Martinov, and V.P. Ivanshin. Altogether, 12 numbers appeared in 9 issues. Lenin criticized the views of the Рабочее дело group in his What is to be Done, again published later in 1905. I'm going to skip notes 4 and 5 because they're pretty much devoid of much information. So Lenin is, when he mentions in the 6th footnote, the program that they put forward in the first issue of Iskra, the note says, the reference is to the article, The Urgent Tasks of Our Movement, which was published as the leading article in Iskra number 1, December 1900. Iskra, the Spark, the first all-Russian illegal Marxist newspaper founded by Lenin in 1900. The foundation of a militant organ of revolutionary Marxism was the main task confronting Russian social democrats at the time. Since the publication of a revolutionary newspaper in Russia was impossible owing to police persecution, Lenin, while still in exile in Siberia, worked out all the details of a plan to publish the paper abroad. When his term of exile ended in January 1900, he immediately began to put his plan into effect. In February, he conducted negotiations with Vera Zasulik, who had come illegally to St. Petersburg from abroad, on the participation of the Emancipation of Labor group in the publication of an all-Russian Marxist newspaper. The so-called Pskov Conference was held in April with V.I. Lenin, L. Martov, Y.O. Tsederbaum, A.N. Potrasov, S.I. Radchenko, and the, quote, legal Marxists, P.B. Struve and M.I. Tugen Baranovsky, participating. The conference heard and discussed Lenin's draft editorial declaration on the program and the aims of the all-Russian newspaper, Iskra, and the scientific and political magazine, Zarya. Lenin visited a number of Russian cities: St. Petersburg, Riga, Pskov, Nizhny Novgorod, Ufa, and Samara, establishing contact with social democratic groups and individual social democrats and obtaining their support for Iskra. In August, when Lenin arrived in Switzerland, he and Potrasov held a conference with the Emancipation of Labor Group on the program and the aims of the newspaper and the magazine, on possible contributors, on the composition of editorial board, and on the problem of residence. For an account of the founding of Iskra, see the article, How the Spark Was Nearly Extinguished. The first issue of Lenin's Iskra was published in Leipzig in December 1900. The ensuing issues were published in Munich. From July 1902, it was published in London, and from the spring of 1903 in Geneva. The editorial board consisted of V.I. Lenin, G.V. Plekhanov, L. Martov, P.B. Axelrod, A.N. Potrasov, and V.I. Zasulik. The first secretary of the editorial board was I.G. Smirnov-Lehman. From the spring of 1901, the post was taken over by N.K. Kripskaya, who was also in charge of all correspondence between Iskra and Russian social democratic organizations. Lenin was actually editor-in-chief and the leading figure in Iskra. He published his articles on all important questions of party organization and the class struggle of the proletariat in Russia, and dealt with the most important events in world affairs. Iskra became, as Lenin had planned, a rallying center for the party forces, a center for the training of leading party workers. In a number of Russian cities, St. Petersburg, Moscow, Samara, and others, groups and committees of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party were organized along Lenin's Iskra line. Iskra organizations sprang up and worked under the direct leadership of Lenin's disciples and comrades in arms: N.E. Bauman, I.V. Babuskin, S.I. Gusev, M.I. Kalinin, G.M. Kurzizanovsky, and others. The newspaper played a decisive role in the struggle for the Marxist Party, in the defeat of the economists, and in the unification of the dispersed social democratic study circles. On the initiative and with the direct participation of Lenin, the editorial board drew up a draft program of the party, published in Iskra number 21, and prepared the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, or RSDLP, which was held in July and August 1903. By the time the Congress was convened, the majority of the local social democratic organizations in Russia had joined forces with Iskra, approved its program, organizational plan, and tactical line, and accepted it as their leading organ. By a special resolution, which rioted the exceptional role played by Iskra in the struggle to build the party, the Congress adopted the newspaper as the central organ of the RSDLP and approved an editorial board consisting of Lenin, Plekhanov, and Martov. Despite the decision of the Congress, Martov refused to participate, and numbers 46 to 51 were edited by Lenin and Plekhanov. Later, Plekhanov went over to the Menshevik position and demanded that all the old Menshevik editors, notwithstanding their rejection by the Congress, be placed on the editorial board. Lenin could not agree to this, and on October 19, November 1, New Style, 1903, he left the Iskra editorial board to strengthen his position in the Central Committee, and from there to conduct a struggle against the Menshevik opportunists. Issue number 52 of Iskra was edited by Plekhanov alone. On November 13, 1903, Plekhanov, on his own initiative, and in violation of the will of the Congress, co-opted all the old Menshevik editors onto the editorial board. Beginning with issue number 52, the Mensheviks turned Iskra into their own opportunist organ. Comment, we will see Lenin's criticism of this in What Is to Be Done, 1905. Keep in mind this stuff is happening back in 1903 here. Okay, so there are two more footnotes, but one of them is the thing I already read about the student strikes in 1900, 1901, and then the eighth is just another footnote talking about briefly about what is to be done. So that is where to begin, and what can we say about this today? So Lenin's main call is to have an all-Russian newspaper. Now you could say, where are we at with that, for example, in the United States today? Well, the thing to keep in mind here is that they already had an organization, which pretty clearly was the leadership of the Marxist, what they called social democratic movement at that time. We don't have that organization. I mean, There's the CPUSA, which apparently sold out long ago. I mean, they have a long history of endorsing Democrats and just generally being pretty useless when it comes to like, I mean, that's the only time I ever see them. I'm not saying they haven't ever done anything useful, like in a practical way, but the only time I ever see them is when they're endorsing a Democrat. That's about it. I mean, I don't know. Somebody wants to defend CPUSA in the comments, go for it. We have PSL. We have Workers' World Party, which PSL is a split off of Workers' World Party. I mean, they seem to be doing this kind of work. I think that they need more membership. So, you know, if somebody wants to comment on the Workers' World versus PSL split, I mean, PSL seems to have a much greater presence, and my understanding is that PSL broke away from Workers' World because they felt that it was not capable of fulfilling its duty and kind of, you know, broke off to free themselves of the constraints that they felt Workers' World was operating under. I mean, they have a high profile, and I have heard 90% good things about PSL. If I was recommending somebody to check out joining a party right now, I would probably point them towards PSL. I've said things about the Green Party. I think that there is local work that you can do there. Certainly, though, that is not a Marxist party. I just think that there is probably room for Marxists to work within that party is why I promote it. Same thing with DSA, who are definitely opportunist. I did a video recently about AOC that perhaps was overly optimistic. You know, AOC basically gave an interview in the New York Times saying that, you know, well, what she calls progressives, I mean the left generally, which includes social democrats or progressives, as well as, you know, socialists and anarchists, you know, had to some extent supported the Joe Biden thing. I mean, some of them did, I didn't. And that, you know, the work that the squad is trying to do, I mean, and then she's saying basically in that interview that it seems like nothing she has tried to do has actually worked within the Democratic Party. Now, this could turn out to be empty words. I thought it was a promising thing for her even to admit that, and maybe it's too much to hope that she does, you know, does Dem exit, which is, I think, the main task the left needs to do now. Get the hell out of the Democratic Party and stop propping it up, stop voting for them, and build a socialist alternative. That kind of, and by which I don't mean the organization Socialist Alternative, which is unfortunately Trotskyist, like many, you know, socialist organizations in the West, including the United States. Well, maybe I had a request from a patron to do like a video or something on the Socialist Equality Party. I mean, to me, it's like, okay, they're trots, end of story. Like, I don't support them and I'm not going to support them. Do I think Trotskyists have a few, you know, laudable positions? Yes, but by and large, they are the embodiment of sectarianism. What is sectarianism? It's when you won't work with people with whom you don't have fundamental contradictions or, you know, conflicts, clashes, differences in your interests. Trotskyists, you know, as basically Marxist-Leninists, ought to be working with other Marxist-Leninists and working towards revolution. But according to Trotskyists, no, only they have the way, and like everybody else is wrong. That is the definition, the picture of sectarianism. If you're a Trotskyist, I mean, you know, the Stalin thing, he died in 1953. We're a long way gone from that. Like, please, you know, there are things about some of the ML movement today that I don't like. Too much social conservatism, for example. But we have to defend Marxism on the economic stuff, at least. And Trotskyists, I think, just need to reassimilate. You know, if you think that that movement is too conservative or whatever, it's not getting any less conservative by your not participating in it. So anyway, we'll leave that there for right now. But on this question of, like, you know, needing an organization first, and then, I mean, I'm not sure technology-wise that calling for, you know, an all USA newspaper like make sense anymore. There's a lot of individualism and alienation built into the culture. People are very predisposed and trained and socialized not to trust any authority whatsoever, even if it's socialist. So, I don't know. To me, it seems like the problem facing the U.S. is a little bit more fundamental of needing that, equivalent of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, something that is really strong, really organized, really real world, with people who are capable of cooperating with each other in a sustained way, exhibiting solidarity, not just composed of exclusively online internet edgelords with anime profile pictures. Sorry if you feel called out, but that's the reality. Like, we need people who can function in society to some extent, who can actually cooperate with people and, don't just form a cult of tough talking. That's not going to actually get us anywhere. So, when I recommend things like, get involved in your Green Party as a Marxist, get involved in DSA as a Marxist, obviously, I don't think that those organizations are going to be leading the struggle forever. They're not really Marxist organizations. But to get the skills, to get out in the community, to learn how to work with people, to learn to move beyond just, you got radicalized online, you watch a lot of videos, you listen to a lot of Socialism for All and like other channels like this, that's tremendous. But you've got to actually get out in the world too. And unfortunately, a lot of the stuff going on in fringe far left communities is pretty fucking toxic. I mean, it's dysfunctional. It's just, it hurts a lot of the people involved, and it kind of goes nowhere at the end of the day. So, that's where those kinds of recommendations come from. If you really want a Marxist-Leninist option, again, my assessment, I'm not involved with them presently, but everything I've heard about PSL suggests that they're probably the place to be for that kind of thing, although they may not be in your area, but check it out. So the USA, it's anyone's guess as to how close we are to a revolutionary situation. We are certainly experiencing desperate immiseration. We're also seeing something I think is interesting. I mentioned earlier the kind of desperation, it seems like, on the part of the US ruling class to resort more and more overtly in the last 20 years under the guise of the war on terror and all that kind of stuff, to just sheer force, just the naked exercise of force, more and more. In other words, the US has really burned through its political capital globally and domestically, except for, people like the maggots and whatever. That kind of soft power is shriveling up. The positive image of the U.S., in many places was gone long ago, and then in other places, it's just been drying up more and more as the U.S. acts violently and exploitively, almost just not even trying to conceal it. So we may be seeing, the U.S. empire has been weak enough to be called the U.S. empire for the last 20 years. Kind of a new development where that was like a mainstream thing. Also, we're seeing, we're on the verge of the world's first trillionaire being produced by the United States. More and more, like 2008, following on the militarization during the 2000s, then we have a major economic breakdown in 2008, a recovery that isn't a recovery during the Obama years. We have a kind of delving into like open sort of, quasi-fascist movement and rhetoric. It's not as threatening as it could be yet, but we certainly saw a turn in that direction, that flavor with Trump, and the emergence of a vicious far-right coalition throughout the world that has just been coming out more and more in the past few decades. So the mask is coming off. What does that mean for the movement? Where am I going with this? Is that, the U.S. famously has had a really hard time organizing sustained socialist movements. Some times in U.S. history have been better than others. The 1900s, teens, 20s, 30s were a time of like massive struggle. And then there was social democracy. The New Deal of the 1930s, which kind of, there was a class peace or a class truce called. Despite that, though, and despite, for example, a strike truce, there was like a no strike pledge during World War II.
there were record numbers of wildcat strikes. Workers didn't care. They were like, we're going to strike anyway. Yet, ultimately, we got beaten back. We got beaten back by things like the Second Red Scare, McCarthyism, and the Taft-Hartley Act in the late 40s. We then see a decline of labor's power in the 50s and 60s, and then neoliberalism in the 70s and 80s, which is where we are now. But my point here is that the U.S. power was kind of expanding that whole time. It was expanding all throughout the 20th century. So although the world communist movement gave a pretty good effort, and many, millions of comrades have fought in some capacity to improve conditions, raise consciousness, and just spread Marxism generally in the United States, they were going up against the rapidly expanding, waxing phase U.S. capitalism. What I'm trying to suggest here is that what may be different now in the 21st century is, I think it peaked. I think that the U.S. is actually on its way down in terms of power. The mask is off. They're having to resort to just naked force. They're clearly struggling to keep it together. People are just buying in less and less to the idea of an American dream or like the hope of being middle class. Like all of that is going away, and that was what that class piece of the 20th century was all about. It was like, hey, look, don't overthrow us. We'll make you middle class. Well, that deal is off. I mean, it's the twice defeat of Bernie Sanders is, concrete evidence. That deal is off. So we're looking at a system that is really struggling to, maintain legitimacy, maybe arrogant, maybe cocky, overestimating its own power. But like I said, there was this long-standing question of like, why doesn't the U.S. have a left in the 20th century? Or why is it so consigned to the fringes? Why can't like a real left get established in the United States? Not the Democrats, but like an actual, you have a right wing, a center right, and then like a real left wing option. The U.S., I think maybe was just too strong. And I think that we're starting to enter the era of the U.S. not being too strong. I don't know exactly where that goes, but I do know that we need to lean in. People should get involved in whatever they can get involved in. Clearly, there will be more uprisings, and I think it's unfortunate that the ones that we had this summer died down, but I'm sure they will be back. That is, you can rest assured those uprisings will be back next year because conditions have only gotten worse. People have only gotten angrier. People's list of grievances is just multiplying at this point. On that note, I'm going to sign off. Hang in there. We will have more audiobooks and things. Thanks to our current patrons whose names are on the screen. And I want to mention that I have been thinking of different things to do with this channel because I was trying to do multiple videos a week. I really can't afford to devote that much time to this channel. And I've been thinking about possibly moving to like a monthly or maybe a bi-weekly format. So if you don't see videos from S4A as frequently, it might be because I'm going to do them in like a once a month or bi-weekly like dump of 2 or 3 or 4 videos. I'm having to do other things, and I just can't quite.
Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the August 2021 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of Anarchism and Socialism by Vladimir Lenin from 1901. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting us on Patreon. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So, this is an audiobook and discussion of Anarchism and Socialism, and keeping in mind the context. So, in 1901, the socialist movement in Russia was finding its footing and building towards what would be the first Russian Revolution in 1905, which didn't succeed at taking power, but did significantly change the landscape of the workers' movement. Lenin was writing a lot at this time, furiously analyzing all current events as they were happening, digesting massive amounts of information, and publishing. It's no wonder that he later became the leader of the revolution, because he was just so on top of things for the preceding 2 decades. They, of course, eventually did take power in 1917. So again, this was written in 1901, first published in 1936 in the magazine Proletarskaya Revoluция number 7, published according to that manuscript. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Foreign Languages Publishing House, 1961, Moscow. Transcription and markup by R. Simbala, and it's in the public domain thanks as usual to the Marxists Internet Archive at marxists.org for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. So let's get into it. Theses. 1. Anarchism in the course of the 35 to 40 years, Bakunin and the International 1866 forward, of its existence, and with Stirner included, in the course of many more years, has produced nothing but general platitudes against exploitation. These phrases have been current for more than 2,000 years. What is missing is A, an understanding of the causes of exploitation, B, an understanding of the development of society, which leads to socialism, C, an understanding of the class struggle as the creative force for the realization of socialism. Thesis 2, an understanding of the causes of exploitation, private property as the basis of commodity economy, social property in the means of production. In anarchism, none of this. Anarchism is bourgeois individualism in reverse, individualism as the basis of the entire anarchist world outlook, defense of petty property and petty economy on the land, no recognition of the majority, negation of the unifying and organizing power of the authority. Thesis 3, failure to understand the development of society, the role of large-scale production, the development of capitalism into socialism. Parentheses, anarchism is a product of despair, the psychology of the unsettled intellectual or the vagabond, and not of the proletarian, in parentheses. 4, failure to understand the class struggle of the proletariat, absurd negation of politics in bourgeois society, failure to understand the role of the organization and the education of the workers, panaceas consisting of one-sided, disconnected means. Thesis 5. What has anarchism, at one time dominant in the Romance countries, contributed in recent European history? No doctrine, revolutionary teaching, or theory. Fragmentation of the working class movement. Complete fiasco in the experiments of the revolutionary movement. Proudhonism 1871, Bakuninism 1873. Finally, subordination of the working class to bourgeois politics in the guise of negation of politics. So that's the end of the audiobook of the 1901 Anarchism and Socialism. As you can see, it's cursory. It's a series of notes which apparently Lenin did not flesh out at the time. However, we have some important points there. There's two I'd like to seize on. The first is anarchism is the product of despair. So it seems to me that there is a tremendous amount of despair in the U.S. working class. I mean, being poor in the U.S. is brutal, and really we don't have anywhere near the level of proletarian working class organization that we used to have. Labor unions are long past their peak, which was in 1960, so quite a while ago now, 61 years ago. People just often feel like they have nowhere to turn. People want change, but they're afraid. They see what the police and the government does to working people just trying to live their lives. It's a brutal system. People know it. Not everybody has very well-developed class consciousness, but I think that sense of, I would like this to be different. We see, for example, polls of workers. If there was a labor union in your workplace, would you join it? 50% say yes, but in reality, we've got less than 10% in unions. This is the product of fear, terror, despair. People are brutalized and terrified. And so it's not that people don't want things to be different. It's that when we stand up, there is a demonstrable history of violence being directed at us and not a tremendous amount of success a lot of the times unless the struggle is very protracted. And, people are spread really thin. Anyway, I wonder if this, connection that Lenin points out of despair and turning to anarchism
isn't a hand-in-hand kind of thing. I think that this was accurate maybe because, people just get to this point where it all looks just hopeless, but you're still carrying around this individualistic mindset. Um, to me, it does seem like when people in the U.S. go left, they tend to be anarchist first, at least. Maybe after you've learned a bit more of a collectivist or socialist mindset, or you get exposed to more of the successes of like Marxism in practice, for example, and the many successful revolutions that there have been, you start to question some of that. I know that I did. I mean, I was exposed to Marx before I was exposed to anarchism, but it was kind of a brief fleeting period in the 90s, and everybody's like, communism's dead, why don't you just forget about that? And I was like, I don't know. I put a finger in it, I guess, to like mark the page in my life and moved on, and then eventually came back to it. But I did have an anarchist phase in there, or at least it seemed like that's where the action was. And but honestly, it just seemed to me like, well, how would you ever take power, etc. But yeah, so I guess, I'd like to explore this thing that Lenin pointed out of the connection of despair and anarchism. I think that that's potentially maybe even a key to getting the U.S. left out of some of the ditch that it's in. I know that this is probably just one piece of it. Anyway, another point that I'd like to make before we wrap up this commentary is one of the last things that Lenin said there, which is the subordination of working class politics to bourgeois politics in the guise of the negation of politics. So you're saying, aha, I'm above it all, I don't believe in politics anymore. And the bourgeoisie says, well, we do, and we're going to keep ruling you. So it's a fundamental tenet of Marxism that workers form parties and develop a political consciousness and engage in a political struggle. That's not what anarchists believe. They believe in building mutual aid networks and other horizontal power structures in their communities and so on. But while they share the idea of smashing the capitalist state with Marxists want to replace it with a workers' state which can oversee the construction of socialism on a mass scale in a sustained way and defend it against counter-revolution, which is inevitable. Capitalists are they're going to come back and try to exploit you again. They want, quote, their stuff back. So that's going to happen. I think that this accounts for the many more successes of Marxism versus anarchism in terms of revolutions actually playing out over time. You look at anarchist strategies for achieving power, and this was one of the big things that really turned me off to anarchism. I was like, how would you ever take power like this and defend your revolution and sustain it? And usually what happens at this point, and there's memes to this effect, which I think are accurate, which is then anarchists start reinventing the workers' state, or the concept of the workers' state, without calling it a state. It's like, congrats, you just saw the need for a workers' state. Go read The State and Revolution, and please join us in the Marxist-Leninist world. One other point off of this whole concept of the negation of politics and the state, libertarianism. So libertarians sometimes refer to themselves as anarchists or anarcho-capitalists, which, of course, everyone else finds ridiculous. Anarchists typically are against capital, the state, and the church. Libertarians are sometimes new atheists, so sometimes they're against the church, and they're definitely against the state, but they're never against capital, which is just utopian at best. We're living in capitalism. That means the bourgeoisie has economic power. Merely taking away the state, they're just going to rebuild it because they have all of the economic power that comes from owning industry. Also, how do you think you're going to defend private property rights without a state? Well, then you're going to hire private security guards. And congrats, you just did what the left anarchists do, which is reinventing the state, albeit in some privatized version. But you have a state, again. So the whole idea is kind of nonsense. I think it keeps workers chasing their tail, but specifically in relation to libertarianism. This concept of the subordination to bourgeois politics under the guise of the negation of politics. I think that is this anarchist concept just taken to its logical conclusion. So I'm sure somebody's going to want to fight me on that. Let's talk it out in the comments. In the meantime, that has been this audiobook and discussion.
The next one to go up on the channel is the similarly titled Socialism and Anarchism by Lenin from 1905. So we'll see you in that one. In the meantime, thanks for listening. Thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. You can get your name on the screen at patreon.com/socialismforall for as little as $2 a month. We appreciate all of your support. It's very encouraging, and it's also materially helpful, so we really appreciate that. If you don't want to become a patron, that's fine. If you do want to help the channel, liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting are all very helpful. That helps to boost us in the algorithm and puts this channel in front of more eyeballs, and it expands the conversation about ending capitalism, building socialism, and learning from the theory and the history of socialists from the past that we can apply to today and take all of those lessons and not repeat the mistakes. So thanks for whatever you do in your life to help to agitate, educate, and organize your comrades, and we will catch you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the December 2022 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of The Lessons of the Crisis by Lenin from 1901. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this piece was first published in Iskra number 7, August 1901, published according to the Iskra text. It is, of course, pretty early in Lenin's works. Iskra was Lenin's newsletter, translates to the Spark. Interesting story about that. If you're interested, check out another audiobook up on the channel called How the Spark Was Nearly Extinguished. It's about an hour-long Lenin story of the founding of Iskra. So anyway, this is Iskra number 7, so again, pretty early, 1901. The first Russian Revolution is still over 3 years away at this point. Anyway, the source is Lenin Collected Works, Foreign Languages, Publishing House, 1961, Moscow, Volume 5. HTML transcription and markup by R. Simbala and D. Walters, and it's in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. Please go check them out, marxists.org. Lastly, quick shout out to Hieronymus for suggesting this text. I'm always open to suggestions, and this one happened to fit, so here we go. The commercial and industrial crisis has already dragged on for almost 2 years. Apparently it is still growing, spreading to new branches of industry and to new districts, and it's becoming more acute as a result of the failure of more banks. Every issue of our newspaper since last December has in one form or another shown the development of the crisis and its disastrous effects. The time has come to raise the general question of the causes and the significance of this phenomenon. For Russia, it's a comparatively new phenomenon, as new as Russian capitalism. Comment here, remember that Russia was much slower to develop capitalism than the Western European countries. Continuing. In the old capitalist countries, i.e. in the countries where the greatest part of the goods is produced for sale, and where the majority of the workers own neither land nor tools, but sell their labor power to employers, to the owners of property, to those whom the land, the factories, the machinery, etc. belong. In the capitalist countries, crises are an old phenomenon, recurring from time to time like attacks of a chronic disease. Hence, crises may be predicted, and when capitalism began to develop with particular rapidity in Russia, the present crisis was predicted in social democratic literature. Comment, social democracy at this time was sort of the blanket term for Marxism. It was social democracy as distinct from bourgeois or capitalist democracy. Second, about the crises being predicted by Marxists. This is basically the boom and bust cycle. It's built into capitalism. Capitalism will produce, then have a crisis of overproduction, and then throw society into chaos for a time being because everybody's depending on that to make a living. Continuing. The pamphlet, The Tasks of the Russian Social Democrats, written at the end of 1897, stated, quote, "We are apparently now passing through the period in the capitalist cycle, a rotation in which the same events repeat themselves like summer and winter, when industry is prospering, when business is brisk, when the factories are working at full capacity, and when countless new factories, new enterprises, joint stock companies, railway enterprises, etc., are springing up like mushrooms. One need not be a prophet to foretell the inevitable and fairly sharp crash that's bound to succeed this period of industrial prosperity. This crash will ruin masses of small owners, will throw masses of workers into the ranks of the unemployed, unquote. And the crash came with a severity unparalleled in Russia. What's the cause of this horrible, chronic disease of capitalist society, which recurs so regularly that its coming can be forecast? So comment here. Basically, this is Russia's introduction to capitalism, and they have so far had the sharpest, most acute crash that they had to date, because capitalism was just setting up shop. So here Lenin is actually explaining to people, here's what capitalism does, and now that it's setting up in our land, here's what to expect. Continuing. Capitalist production cannot develop otherwise than by leaps and bounds, 2 steps forward and 1 step, and sometimes 2, back. As we have said, capitalist production is production for sale, the production of commodities for the market. Production is conducted by individual capitalists, each producing on his own, and none of them able to say exactly what kind and what amount of commodities will be required on the market. Production is carried on haphazardly. Each producer is concerned only in excelling the others. Quite naturally, therefore, the quantity of commodities produced may not correspond to the market demand. This probability becomes particularly great when the enormous market is suddenly extended to new, huge, unexplored territories. This was precisely the situation at the beginning of the industrial boom that we experienced not so long ago. The capitalists of all of Europe stretched out their paws towards that part of the globe inhabited by hundreds of millions of people, toward Asia, of which until recently only India and a small section of the coastal regions had been closely connected with the world market. The Trans-Caspian Railway began to open up Central Asia for the capitalists. The Great Siberian Railway, great not only because of its length, but because of the unrestricted plunder of the treasury by the contractors and the unrestricted exploitation of the workers who built it, opened up Siberia. Japan began to develop into an industrial nation and strove to make a breach in the Chinese wall, opening the way to a choice morsel into which the capitalists of England, Germany, France, Russia, and even Italy immediately plunged their teeth. The construction of gigantic railways, the expansion of the world market, and the growth of commerce all stimulated an unexpected revival of industry, an increase of new enterprises, a wild hunt for commodity markets, a hunt for profits, the floating of new companies, and the attraction to industry of masses of fresh capital, which consisted partly of these small savings of small capitalists. It is not surprising that this wild world hunt for new and unknown markets led to a terrific crash. To obtain a clear idea of the nature of this hunt for markets and profits, we must remember what giants took part in it. When we speak of separate enterprises and individual capitalists, we sometimes forget that, strictly speaking, these terms are inexact. In reality, only the appropriation of profit has remained individual, but production itself has become social. Gigantic crashes have become possible and inevitable only because powerful social productive forces have become subordinated to a gang of rich men whose only concern is to make profits. We shall illustrate this by an example from Russian industry. Recently, the crisis has spread to the oil industry, in which such enterprises as the Nobel Brothers Oil Company are engaged. In 1899, the company sold 163 million poods of oil products to the value of 53,500,000 rubles, while in 1900, it sold 192 million poods to the value of 72 million rubles. In 1 year, a single enterprise increased the value of its output by 85.5 million rubles. This, quote, single enterprise is maintained by the combined labor of tens and hundreds of thousands of workers engaged in extracting oil and refining it, in delivering it by pipeline, railways, seas, and rivers, and in making the necessary machinery, warehouses, materials, lighters, steamers, etc. These tens of thousands of workers work for the whole of society, but their labor is controlled by a handful of millionaires who appropriate the entire profit earned by the organized labor of this mass of workers. In 1899, the Nobel Company made a net profit of 4 million rubles, and in 1900, the figure was 6 million rubles, of which the shareholders received 1,300 rubles per 5,000 ruble share, with 5 members of the board of directors receiving bonuses to the amount of 528,000 rubles. When several such enterprises fling themselves into the wild chase for a place in an unknown market, is it surprising that a crisis sets in? Furthermore, for an enterprise to make profit, its goods must be sold, purchasers must be found. The purchasers of these goods must comprise the entire population, because these colossal enterprises produce whole mountains of goods. But 9/10 of the population of all capitalist countries are poor. They're workers who receive extremely miserable wages, and peasants who, in the main, live even worse than the workers. Now, when, in the period of a boom, the large industrial enterprises set out to produce as vast a quantity of goods as possible, they flood the market with such a huge quantity of goods that the majority of the population, being poor, cannot pay for them. The number of machines, tools, warehouses, railroads, etc. continues to grow. From time to time, however, this process of growth is interrupted because the masses of the people, for whom, in the last analysis, these improved instruments of production are intended, remain in a state of poverty that verges on beggary. The crisis shows that modern society could produce immeasurably more goods for the improvement of the living conditions of the entire working people if the land, factories, machines, etc. had not been seized by a handful of private owners who extract millions of profits out of the poverty of the people. The crisis shows that the workers should not confine themselves to the struggle for individual concessions from the capitalists. Comment: note that Lenin says the workers should not confine themselves to the struggle for individual concessions from the capitalists. He does not write, never seek concessions from the capitalists. He says, do not confine yourselves to that struggle, because that is what we call reformism. Reformism is when you exclusively seek reforms, but never seek to remove capitalists from power. A revolutionary approach, on the contrary to a purely reformist one, can use reforms, but does not limit itself to reforms. Continuing. When industry is in upswing, such concessions may be won. The Russian workers, on more than one occasion between 1894 and 1898, won concessions by energetic struggle. But when the crash comes, the capitalists not only withdraw the concessions they made, but take advantage of the helpless position of the workers to force down wages still lower. And so things will inevitably continue until the army of the socialist proletariat overthrows the domination of capital and private property. The crisis shows how nearsighted were those socialists who call themselves, quote, critics, probably because they borrow uncritically the doctrines of the bourgeois economists, who 2 years ago loudly proclaimed that crashes were becoming less and less probable. The lessons of the crisis, which has exposed the absurdity of subordinating social production to private property, are so instructive that even the bourgeois press is now demanding stricter supervision, for example, over the banks. But no supervision will prevent the capitalists from setting up enterprises in times of boom, which must inevitably become bankrupt later on. Alchevsky, the founder of a land and a commercial bank in Kharkov, both now bankrupt, acquired millions of rubles by fair means or foul for the purpose of establishing and maintaining mining and metallurgical enterprises that promised wealth beyond the dreams of avarice. A hitch in industry wrecked these banks and mining and metallurgical enterprises, the Donets-Yuriev Company. But what does the crash of enterprises mean in capitalist society? It means that the smaller capitalists, capitalists of the second magnitude, are eliminated by the big millionaires. The place of Alchevsky, the Kharkov millionaire, is taken by the Moscow millionaire, Ryabushinsky, who, being a richer capitalist, will bring greater pressure to bear on the workers. The supplanting of smaller capitalists by big capitalists, the increased power of capital, the ruination of masses of small property owners, e.g. small investors who lose all their property in a bank crash, the frightful impoverishment of the workers, all this is brought about by the crisis. We recall also cases described in Iskra of capitalists lengthening the working day and discharging class-conscious workers in an effort to replace them by more submissive people from the villages. The effect of the crisis in Russia is in general ever so much greater than in any other country. Stagnation in industry is accompanied by famine among the peasantry. Unemployed workers are being sent out of the towns to the villages, but where can the unemployed peasants be sent? By sending the workers to the villages, the authorities desire to clear the cities of the discontented people, but perhaps those sent out will be able to rouse at least part of the peasantry from its age-long submission and induce it not only to request but to demand. The workers and peasants are being drawn closer to each other, not only by unemployment and hunger, but also by police tyranny, which deprives the workers of the possibility of uniting to defend their own interests and prevents even the aid of well-disposed people from reaching the peasantry. The heavy paw of the police is becoming 100 times heavier for the millions of people who have lost all means of livelihood. The gendarmes, soldiers, and the police in the towns, the rural superintendents, and the village policemen in the rural districts see clearly that hatred against them is growing, and they are beginning to fear not only the food kitchens set up in the villages, but even advertisements in the newspapers appealing for funds. Afraid of voluntary contributions, in truth, the thief fears his own shadow. When the thief sees a passerby offering alms to the man he has robbed, he begins to think that the two are shaking hands in a pledge to settle accounts with him. That's the end of the audiobook. So what do you think? Leave a question or comment below. We'll continue the discussion there. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. We don't run ads or sponsorships on this channel, so that support is key. I would make content even if nobody supported, but that support is both encouraging and allows me to spend more time doing this than I'd be able to do otherwise. So if you like this channel, thank a patron and consider becoming one. Otherwise, whether you're a patron or not, like, share, subscribe, and comment. All of that helps YouTube to promote these videos to more and more people. The channel has been growing steadily every month. We'd like to see it continue to do that, so we appreciate all your engagement. And speaking of engagement, learning this online is great, but don't forget, it doesn't really matter if it just stays in your head. Class struggle is occurring all around you. You need to get involved with whatever political parties and organizations and unions may be present in your area or county or state. Trust me, no matter where you are, there is something going on that you can help to grow. So make yourself available, network with your local left, get to know them, let them get to know you, and you will find projects that you're able to contribute to on a sustained basis. We have to build this because conditions are not getting any better on their own, let's put it that way. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the April 2022 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of why the Social Democrats must declare a determined and relentless war on the socialist revolutionaries by Lenin from 1902. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe. And we don't run ads on this channel, so consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So before we get into the credits or the text, I just want to clear up a couple things that might be confusing to newcomers to socialist history about some of the terminology in the title of this piece. So it's called Why the Social Democrats, which we associate today with sort of like reformist welfare capitalists. But back in the day, social democrats were basically, that was the term for Marxists, because the split between what we would call social democrats today and socialists or communists had not really happened yet. So anyway, social democracy was the general term for Marxism. So when he says why the Social Democrats must declare a determined and relentless war, he means why the Marxists must declare a determined and relentless war on the socialist revolutionaries. Now, from the sound of it, you would think, well, that's like today's communists, right? So revolutionary socialists, but that's not what it is. The social revolutionaries or socialist revolutionaries were a party in Russian left politics at that time, early 20th century, which were basically the successors of the populists, Narodniki. They were left. They supported the peasants against the landowners, but they were considerably different and distinct from the Bolsheviks or the Mensheviks. Anyway, so Lenin is basically writing this piece to underline and draw attention to some of the differences between the Social Democrats and the Socialist Revolutionaries, and that's what this piece is all about. So this was written in June and July of 1902. It was first published in 1923 in the magazine Projector, number 14, and published according to that manuscript. The source is Lenin, Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1964, Volume 6. The HTML transcription and markup were done by R. Cimbala and D. Walters, and it's in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive, which is part of the Marxists Internet Archive, found at marxists.org on the internet, thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this file, and thousands of other free Marxist texts. One last note from me before we get started with the text. What was going on in the summer of 1902? Well, it had been a few years since Lenin and others had founded Iskra, the Spark, which was the newsletter of their political circle, and the struggle was going in earnest. It was still a few years away from the first Russian Revolution, which was 1905, and then 15 years away from the final Bolshevik Revolution in October of 1917. But things were going in that direction, and so Lenin was, writing this piece to basically make a case for the party that he belonged to versus the socialist revolutionaries. So let's begin. 1. Because that trend in our social thought, which goes by the name of socialist revolutionary, is in fact moving away, and has indeed moved away from the only international theory of revolutionary socialism existing today, i.e. from Marxism. In the great split of international social democracy into an opportunist wing, or Bernsteinian, and a revolutionary wing, this trend has taken up an entirely indefinite and impermissibly irresolute position between two stools. Basing itself solely on the bourgeois and opportunist criticism of Marxism, it has pronounced the latter to have been shaken and promised on its part to revise Marxism anew in its own way, but has done nothing whatsoever to fulfill this ominous promise. Footnote there, what does Bernsteinian mean? So Edward Bernstein was one of the chief early distorters and just destroyers of Marxism. He opposed key tenets of Marxism, such as class struggle and the need for revolution, and Lenin was a big opponent of him. So basically, in point 1 here, Lenin is accusing the socialist revolutionaries of, in the face of a big, split within Marxism, of them not picking a side, which is something you actually need to do in a time of crisis for Marxism. You need to actually defend the correct side against the attacks and distortions. So Lenin says that the socialist revolutionaries based themselves on the bourgeois and opportunist criticisms of Marxism. So in other words, not good-natured proletarian criticisms, but bourgeois opportunist really attacks on Marxism, taking the guise of criticism. And so the socialist revolutionaries are promising to revise it anew, but Lenin says that they haven't really done anything to fulfill, quote, this ominous promise. Like, okay, you're promising to do something. It sounds, maybe even if you do it, like it wouldn't be a good thing, but they haven't even done anything. So, continuing. Point 2. Because the socialist revolutionary trend helplessly yields to the dominant tendency in Russian social and political thought, which should be termed liberal narrotism. Repeating the era of the Narodnaya Volya and of old Russian socialism in general, the socialist revolutionaries fail to see the sheer flabbiness and internal contradictions of this tendency. Their independent creative contribution to Russian revolutionary thought is restricted to tacking revolutionary phrases on to the Old Testament of liberal Narodnik wisdom. Russian Marxism was the first to undermine the theoretical foundations of liberal narratism, to lay bare its bourgeois and petty bourgeois class content, and to have waged and continue to wage war against it, undeterred by the desertion of a swarm of critical, read opportunist, Marxists to the enemy camp. But the stand the socialist revolutionaries have been holding in this war is at best one of hostile neutrality. Here again, they have seated themselves between two stools, between Russian Marxism, from which they have borrowed only a few paltry shreds, and quasi-socialist liberal narratism. 3. Because the socialist revolutionaries, owing to their above-mentioned complete lack of principle in questions of international and Russian socialism, do not understand or do not recognize the only really revolutionary principle, that of the class struggle. They do not understand that only a party which fuses socialism with the Russian working class movement, being engendered with increasing force and on an increasing scale by the growth of Russian capitalism, can be really revolutionary and truly socialist in Russia today. The attitude of the socialist revolutionaries toward the Russian working class movement has always been that of dilettante spectators, and when, for instance, that movement contracted the illness of economism as a consequence of its amazingly rapid growth, the socialist revolutionaries, on the one hand, gloated over the mistakes made by people who were working at the new and difficult task of rousing the masses of the workers, and on the other hand, put a spoke in the wheel of revolutionary Marxism when it launched and victoriously carried through the struggle against this economism. Quick footnote, what is economism? Economism is when you limit the struggle from any revolutionary aims and you focus solely on improvements for the working class under capitalism. Better pay, better conditions, better schedules, etc. The correct thing to do is always to agitate for as much as you can get, but never lose sight of the need to end capitalism, and as quickly as possible at that. But economism does exactly that. It basically puts kind of a lot of faith in bourgeois intellectuals and backs off of revolutionary goals. Continuing. A half-hearted attitude towards this working class movement inevitably leads, in fact, to aloofness from it. And owing to this aloofness, the Socialist Revolutionary Party has no social basis whatever. It does not rely upon any social class, for the term class cannot be applied to a group of unstable intellectuals who qualify their vagueness and lack of principle as broadness. Another comment there, that's the end of point 3, is when Lenin says they do not understand that only a party which fuses socialism with the Russian working class movement, being engendered with increasing force and on an increasing scale by the growth of Russian capitalism. So the socialist revolutionaries, like the populists that came before them, held some theories such as that the peasantry was the revolutionary class and that Russia could go directly from feudalism to socialism, and these theories were basically opposed by Lenin. Continuing. 4. Because by assuming a disdainful attitude towards socialist ideology and seeking to rely simultaneously and in an equal degree upon the intelligentsia, the proletariat, and the peasantry, the Socialist Revolutionary Party thereby inevitably, whether it wants to or not, leads to the political and ideological enslavement of the Russian proletariat by Russian bourgeois democracy. A disdainful attitude towards theory, evasiveness, and shilly-shallying with regard to socialist ideology inevitably play into the hands of bourgeois ideology. As social strata comparable with the proletariat, the Russian intelligentsia and the Russian peasantry can serve as the mainstay only of a bourgeois democratic movement. This is not only a consideration that stems necessarily from our teachings as a whole, which regard the small producer, for instance, as revolutionary only to the extent that he makes a clean break with the society of commodity economy and capitalism, and places himself at the standpoint of the proletariat. No, it is also an absolute fact which is already beginning to make itself felt. At the moment of the political revolution and on the day after this revolution, this fact will inevitably make itself felt with still greater force. Socialist revolutionarism is one of the manifestations of petty bourgeois ideological instability and petty bourgeois vulgarization of socialism, against which social democracy must and will always wage determined war. Point 5. Because the practical demands of the program which the socialist revolutionaries have, I won't say brought forward, but at least outlined, have already quite clearly revealed the enormous harm caused in practice by the unprincipled character of this trend. For example, their agrarian minimum program, as outlined in issue 8 of Revolutionная Russia, this was an illegal newspaper of the Socialist Revolutionaries published from the end of 1900 in Russia by the League of Socialist Revolutionaries, and then in Geneva from January 1902 to December 1905. That agrarian minimum program, as outlined, or perhaps it would be more correct to say, scattered among the time-worn premises of our narratism, in the first place misleads both the peasantry by promising it a minimum socialization of the land, and the working class by giving it an entirely wrong impression of the true nature of the peasant movement. Such frivolous promises only compromise a revolutionary party in general. In particular, they compromise the teaching of scientific socialism concerning the socialization of all means of production as our ultimate aim. Secondly, By including the support and development of cooperatives in their minimum program, the socialist revolutionaries completely abandon the ground of revolutionary struggle and degrade their so-called socialism to the level of the most banal, petty bourgeois reformism. Thirdly, by opposing the demand of the Social Democrats for the abolition of all the medieval fetters that bind our village commune, tie the mujik to his allotment, deny him freedom of movement, and unavoidably entail his humiliation as member of the socialist state, the socialist revolutionaries have shown that they have not even been able to safeguard themselves against the reactionary doctrines of Russian narratism. 6. Because the socialist revolutionaries, by including terrorism in their program and advocating it in its present-day form as a means of political struggle, are thereby doing the most serious harm to the movement, destroying the indissoluble ties between socialist work and the mass of the revolutionary class. No verbal assurances and vows can disprove the unquestionable fact that present-day terrorism, as practiced and advocated by the socialist revolutionaries, is not connected in any way with work among the masses, for the masses, or together with the masses. That the organization of terroristic acts by the party distracts our very scanty organizational forces from their difficult and by no means completed task of organizing a revolutionary workers' party. That in practice, the terrorism of the socialist revolutionaries is nothing else than single combat, a method that has been wholly condemned by the experience of history. Even foreign socialists are beginning to become embarrassed by the noisy advocacy of terrorism advanced today by our socialist revolutionaries. Among the masses of the Russian workers, this advocacy simply sows harmful illusions, such as the idea that terrorism, quote, compels people to think politically, even against their will, quoted from Revolutionary Russia, issue 7, page 4. Or that, quote, more effectively than months of verbal propaganda, it is capable of changing the views of thousands of people with regard to the revolutionaries and the meaning of their activity, unquote. Or that it is capable of, quote, infusing new strength into the waverers, those discouraged and shocked by the sad outcome of many demonstrations, unquote, and so on. These harmful illusions can only bring about early disappointment and weaken the work of preparing the masses for the onslaught upon the autocracy. So that's the end of the audiobook. So again, this was pretty early, 1902, still 3 years before the first Russian Revolution, in which some reforms were exacted from the Tsarist regime. And it was not the last time, by far, that Lenin would write criticisms of the socialist revolutionaries. In fact, in the end, in the very end, like 1917, it would be a faction of the socialist revolutionaries who, transformed by 15 plus years of struggle at that point, eventually did see the value in supporting the Bolsheviks against some of the other factions who, in 1917, the Mensheviks and some of the other socialist revolutionaries were just flat out backing the bourgeois provisional government and were just preparing to pave the way for post-Tsarist capitalism in Russia. Some of them, again, did come over in the end to the Bolsheviks, helped the Bolsheviks to win political control of the Soviets, and this was fairly decisive as far as the October Revolution 1917 was concerned. Anyway, we're going to leave it there for now. What do you think? Leave a question or comment in the comment section below. We'll continue the discussion there as always. In the meantime, thanks for listening. And thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. Again, we do not run ads on this channel, so the people whose names you see here are the only ones we're getting financial support from right now, and we really appreciate it. If you'd like to get your name on the screen and contribute financial support, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month or more, whatever you see fit. Every contribution is encouraging. They are also materially helpful, so thank you for those, as they have allowed me to spend a lot more time creating more content than I would have been able to do without that support. Beyond that, engagement with the channel, liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting, even if it's just thanks or good video, all of that helps to boost the channel in the YouTube algorithm, helps more people to see and stumble across this content. That's what we're trying to do. It is socialism for all. We're trying to make this as accessible as possible so that working class people have that much easier a time getting their hands on some quality information and analysis from a working class perspective. Finally, all the education, analysis, and agitation in the world will only get you so far. Remember to join an organization, find something in your community that is doing the kind of work you'd like to be a part of, that is supporting working class people in breaking free from capitalist domination of our lives. This can be political parties, not the Democrats, not the Democratic Party. Let me say that again, not the Democratic Party. But political parties being organized by and for workers that don't take capitalist money, labor unions, tenant unions, other community organizations, helping people come together in struggle for better conditions and an eventual end to capitalism. Join it, get involved, take this education and agitation with you, network with other like-minded people, build strong organizations, and in this way we can make a movement that can actually produce real political change of and for working people, not just some better kind of capitalism. All right, thanks again, and we will catch you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the June 2022 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of the draft of a new law on strikes by Lenin from 1902. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this piece was first published in Iskra number 24, September 1st, 1902. Published here according to the Iskra text. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1964, Moscow, Volume 6. HTML transcription and markup by R. Simbala and D. Walters. And it's in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive, marxists.org. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. So let's begin the audiobook. We have come into possession of a new confidential document, the memorandum of the Ministry of Finance, quote, on a revision of articles in the law which make strikes and breaches of contract of hire punishable, and on the desirability of instituting workers' organizations for purposes of mutual aid. In view of the length of this memorandum and the need to acquaint the broadest possible sections of the working class with it, we are publishing it as a separate pamphlet. Footnote, Lenin here is referring to the pamphlet, The Autocracy and Strikes, the memorandum of the Ministry of Finance on permitting strikes, published in 1902 in Geneva by the League of Russian Revolutionary Social Democracy Abroad. Back to the text. At present, however, we shall give a brief review of the contents of this interesting document and point out its importance. The memorandum begins with a short survey of the history of our factory legislation, mentioning the laws of June 3rd, 1886 and June 2nd, 1897, and then proceeds to the question of the abolition of criminal liability for leaving employment and for striking. Footnote, the law of June 3rd, 1886 was regulations on supervision of the enterprises of the factory industry and on relations between factory owners and workers. It was passed under the influence of the working class movement in the Moscow, Vladimir, and Yaroslavl gubernias, and in particular the famous Morozov strike of 1885. The chief feature of the law of June 3rd, 1886 was the certain restriction it placed on the arbitrary right of factory owners to exact fines from the workers, hence it became known as the law on fines. Lenin gave a detailed analysis and criticism of this law in the pamphlet Explanation of the Law on Fines Imposed on Factory Workers. The law of June 2nd, 1897 was on the duration and distribution of working hours in enterprises of the factory industry. It introduced, for the first time in Russian history, legislative limitation of the working day for part of the workers in large-scale industry. Like the law of June 3rd, 1886, it was passed under the influence of the working class movement in the 1890s, particularly the mass strikes of the St. Petersburg workers in 1895 to 96. See Lenin's pamphlet, The New Factory Law, which gives an analysis and criticism. Back to the text. The Ministry of Finance is of the opinion that the threat of arrest or imprisonment for workers leaving work without permission, or for a number of workers downing tools by agreement among themselves, fails in its purpose. Experience has shown that this does not ensure the maintenance of public order. This threat merely embitters the workers, convincing them of the injustice of the law. The enforcement of these laws is very difficult, quote, in view of the extreme burdensomeness of instituting hundreds and sometimes thousands of proceedings, unquote, if every worker who leaves their job is to be tried, and also in view of the fact that it is unprofitable for the factory owner to lose workers if the latter are imprisoned for going on strike. Making strikes a criminal offense leads to inordinately zealous interference by the police, which does more harm than good, bringing the employers more difficulties and trouble than relief. The memorandum proposes the complete abolition of the individual worker's liability for leaving a factory of their own accord, or for participating in peaceable strikes, ones that are unattended by violence or breaches of public law and order, etc. Following the example of legislation abroad, penalties should be imposed only for, quote, violence, threats, or defamation practiced by any employer or worker against the person or property of a third person, with the object of compelling the latter, despite their free and lawful intentions, to work or to abstain from working on certain terms. And emphasize the defamation with an exclamation point. In other words, instead of criminal liability for participation in strikes, the proposal is to make it a crime to interfere with, quote, persons desiring to work. As to the mutual aid societies, the Ministry of Finance complains of arbitrariness on the part of the administrative authorities, which it claims is particularly noticeable in Moscow, where the Society of Mechanics even claimed the right to, quote, mediate between workers and management, and demands legislative enactment of proper regulations for such societies and assistance in their organization. Footnote there on the Society of Mechanics. This was officially the Society for Mutual Aid of Workers Engaged in Mechanical Production. It was formed in Moscow in May 1901 with the participation of the secret police. Its rules were confirmed by the Governor General of Moscow on February 14, 1902. The formation of the society was one of the attempts made to implant, quote, police socialism, Zubatovism, in order to divert the workers from the revolutionary struggle. The demagogic flirting of the police with the workers, and in particular the attempts made by Zubatov agents, who controlled the Society of Mechanics, to assume the right to mediate in conflicts between employers and workers, evoked dissatisfaction among Moscow factory owners and protests from the Ministry of Finance, which reflected their interests. Under the impact of the growing working class movement, the role of the society, like that of other Zubatov organizations, dwindled away after 1903. Back to the text. Thus, the general spirit of the new memorandum of the Ministry of Finance is undoubtedly liberal, and its main point is the proposal to abolish criminal liability for participation in strikes. We shall not analyze the contents of the entire bill in detail here. It will be more convenient to do so after the memorandum has been published in full, but shall merely call the reader's attention to the nature and significance of this liberalism. The proposal to give the workers a certain right to strike and to organize is nothing new, not only in our liberal publicist writings, but even in projects coming from official government commissions. In the early 60s, the Stackelberg Commission, which revised factory and artisan regulations, proposed that factory courts elected from among the workers and the employers be set up and that some freedom of organization be granted to the workers. In the 80s, the commission charged with drafting a new criminal code proposed the abolition of criminal liability for participation in strikes. However, the present draft of the Ministry of Finance differs substantially from the earlier projects, and this difference will remain an extremely important sign of the times, even if the proposed new draft is pigeonholed like all others before it. This essential difference consists in the fact that the new draft rests on an incomparably sounder foundation. In it, you sense not only the voice of a few progressive theorists and ideologists of the bourgeoisie, but the voice of an entire section of practical industrialists. This is no longer the liberalism of, quote, humane government officials and professors alone. It is the homebred, native liberalism of the Moscow merchants and manufacturers. Let me say frankly that this fills my heart with a lofty patriotic pride. The two-penny, half-penny liberalism of the merchant means much more than the shilling liberalism of the government official. And what is most interesting in the memorandum is not the nauseating talk about freedom of contract and the interests of the state, but the practical considerations of the manufacturers, which break right through the traditional juridical arguments. This is intolerable. We're fed up. Keep out of it. This is what the Russian manufacturer is saying to the Russian police through the medium of the author of the ministerial memorandum. Just listen indeed to the following line of reasoning. Quote, to the police authorities, who find support in the vagueness and ambiguity of the existing law, every strike comes not as a natural economic phenomenon, but invariably as a breach of public law and order. If, however, a calmer attitude existed with regard to stoppages of work at factories, and strikes were not made synonymous with breaches of public order, it would be much easier to ascertain the true causes of such, to separate lawful and justifiable grounds from those that are unlawful and untenable, and to take the necessary steps towards peaceful agreement between the two parties. Given a more normal state of affairs such as this, restrictive and repressive measures would be resorted to only when disorder was patently in evidence, unquote. The police do not go into the reasons for a strike. They are concerned solely with cutting it short, to which end they resort to one of two methods. Either they force the workers, by arrests, deportation, and other measures, quote, up to and including the use of armed force, to return to work, or they prompt the employers to make concessions. Quote, it cannot be said that either of these methods suits messieurs the manufacturers. The former, quote, embitters the workers. The latter, quote, confirms the workers in the extremely harmful belief that a strike is the surest way of getting what they want in every case. Quote, the history of strikes during the last decade affords many illustrations of the harm resulting from the efforts to suppress the resulting complications rapidly and at any cost. Hurriedly made arrests have at times so incensed workers who were completely calm until then that Cossacks had to be brought into action. And after that, of course, any satisfaction, even of the legitimate demands of the strikers, was out of the question. On the other hand, cases of prompt satisfaction of the workers' unlawful demands by means of pressure upon the manufacturers did not fail to evoke similar strikes in other industrial enterprises where it became necessary to resort to military force rather than to a system of concessions, which is sometimes entirely incomprehensible to the workers. So patronizing, and strengthens their conviction that the authorities are unjust and despotic towards them, unquote. Yeah. What an unfounded conviction. That the police should ever satisfy even unlawful demands of the workers by means of pressure upon the manufacturers, that of course is a fancy of messieurs the capitalists, who want to say that in some cases they themselves, after some bargaining with the strikers, would concede less than they have to concede under the pressure of the grim prospect of, quote, breaches of state law and order, unquote. The memorandum has a dig at the Ministry of the Interior, which, in its circular letter of August 12, 1897, quote, issued without agreement with the Ministry of Finance, unquote, that is where the crux of the matter lies, prescribes both arrest and deportation in every strike, and demands that every case connected with strikes be dealt with as required by the emergency regulations. Quote, the higher administrative authorities, continues the memorandum, setting forth the complaints of the manufacturers, quote, go still further than the law and flatly regard all cases of strikes as matters of state importance. Actually, however, every strike, of course, if not accompanied by violence, is a purely economic phenomenon, which is quite natural and in no way jeopardizes public law and order. In these cases, law and order should be maintained in the same way as during popular festivities, celebrations, performances, and like occasions, unquote. This is the language of genuine Manchester liberals, who proclaim that the struggle between capital and labor is a purely natural phenomenon, who with remarkable frankness put on a par, quote, trade in commodities and, quote, trade in labor, elsewhere in the memorandum, demand non-interference by the state, and assign to the state the role of night and day watchman. And, what is of particular importance, the Russian manufacturers have been compelled to adopt this liberal standpoint by none other than our workers. The working class movement has spread so greatly that strikes really have become, quote, natural economic phenomena. The workers' struggle has assumed such stubborn forms that interference by the police state, which prohibits all manifestations of this struggle, has really begun to prove harmful, not only to the workers, to whom it has, of course, never brought anything but harm, but even to the manufacturers themselves, on whose behalf this interference was practiced. The workers actually deprived the police prohibitions of all force, but the police continued, and in an autocratic state could not but continue, to interfere, and feeling their impotence, kept going from side to side, from armed force to concessions, from savage reprisals to blandishments. The less effective that police intervention proved, the more keenly did the manufacturers feel the arbitrariness of the police. The more inclined they were to believe that it did not pay them to support this arbitrariness. The conflict between a certain section of the big industrialists and the all-powerful police became more and more intense, assuming particularly acute forms in Moscow, where the system of flirting with the workers had flourished most luxuriantly. The memorandum openly complains of the Moscow authorities, who were carrying on a dangerous game with workers' conferences and the Workers' Mutual Aid Society in the engineering industry. In order to decoy the workers, it became necessary to grant the council of this society a certain right of mediation, and the manufacturers immediately began to kick. Quote, at first, this council, the memorandum says at their dictation, quote, applied to the factory inspectorate, but seeing that the latter did not recognize its right to act as mediator, a role which it had assumed on its own, it began to turn to the chief of police, who not only accepts the tendered statements, but acts on them in due course, thus sanctioning the rights which the council has arrogated to itself. Unquote. The manufacturers are protesting against particular administrative decrees and demand the legislative enactment of a new system. True, the manufacturers' liberalism has not ventured so far beyond the extremely narrow limits of their specific interests. Their hostility to police arbitrariness is limited to individual cases of police excesses which are not to their advantage, and is not leveled against the mainstays of bureaucratic despotism, but by aggravating the class antagonisms in the capitalist countries, the economic development of Russia and of the whole world will foster the growth of this hostility, provide greater grounds for it, and justify it. The proletariat's strength lies precisely in the growth of its numbers and its solidarity as a result of the very process of economic development, while the interests of the big and petty bourgeoisie become more and more scattered and divided. To take into account this, quote, natural advantage of the proletariat, the social democrats, meaning at that time Marxists, must closely watch all clashes of interests among the ruling classes, using these clashes not only in order to gain practical advantages for one section or another of the working class, but also for the purpose of enlightening the entire working class, for the purpose of deriving a useful lesson from each new political and social incident. The practical advantage which the workers stand to gain from the revision of the law proposed by the liberal manufacturers is too obvious to be dwelt on at length. It is an undoubted concession to a growing force, an abandonment by the enemy of one of his positions, which the revolutionary proletariat has practically captured already, and which the more far-seeing leaders of the hostile army no longer care to defend. Of course, this is no big concession. First of all, it is ridiculous even to think that real freedom, the right to strike, is possible without political liberty. The police still retain the right to make arrests and to deport without trial, and will retain that right so long as the autocracy continues to exist. And the retention of this right means preservation of 9/10 of the police interference, the outrages, and the high-handedness, which are beginning to disgust even the manufacturers. Second, even in the narrow sphere of factory legislation itself, the Ministry of Finance is taking a very timid step forward, copying the German bill, which the German workers have dubbed the hard labor bill, and preserving special penalties, quote, for violence, threats, or defamation in connection with the contract of hire, as if general penal laws covering these offenses did not exist. Footnote there, the so-called hard labor bill, or the Zuchthausvorlage, introduced in the German Reichstag in 1899 on the insistence of the employers and Emperor Wilhelm II. The bill imposed from 1 to 5 years of prison, or a fine of up to 1,000 marks on anyone who, quote, by violence, threats, insults, or a declaration of dishonesty, unquote, helped workers take part in unions and agreements, incited them to strike, or tried to oppose strike breaking. Under pressure from the working class movement, the hard labor bill was turned down in the Reichstag on November 20, 1899, by the votes of the left parties and the center party. Back to the text. But the Russian workers will know how to utilize even this small concession so as to strengthen their positions, to intensify and extend their great struggle for the emancipation of working humanity from wage slavery. As to the useful lesson taught us by the new memorandum, we must note primarily that the protest of the manufacturers against the medieval strike law affords us a small and particular example of the general incompatibility of interests between the developing bourgeoisie and moribund absolutism. This should give food for thought to those people who, like the socialist revolutionaries, populists, have hitherto timidly shut their eyes to the elements of bourgeois opposition in Russia, and who continued to reiterate as of old that the, quote, interests, in general, of the Russian bourgeoisie are satisfied. It turns out that police arbitrariness clashes now with some, now with other interests of even those sections of the bourgeoisie that are most directly protected by the czarist police and are threatened directly with material loss by any loosening of the fetters placed on the proletariat. It turns out that a real revolutionary movement disorganizes the government not only directly by the fact that it enlightens, rouses, and unites the exploited masses, but also indirectly by the fact that it cuts the ground from under antiquated laws, destroys the faith in the autocracy even of those who would seem to be its confederates, increases family squabbles among these confederates, and replaces firmness and unity in the camp of the enemy by dissension and wavering. But in order to achieve such results, one condition is required, which our socialist revolutionaries have never been able to grasp. It is necessary that the movement should be truly revolutionary, i.e. that it should rouse to a new life ever broader sections of the really revolutionary class, that it should actually refashion the spiritual and political makeup of this class, and through it, of all those who come in contact with it. If the socialist revolutionaries, again, these were populists in a separate party from the Marxists, grasp this truth, they would understand what practical harm is wrought by their ideological poverty and the unprincipledness of their approach to the fundamental problems of socialism. They would understand that it is not the forces of the government, but those of the revolution that are disorganized by people who preach that against the crowd the autocracy has its soldiers and against organizations, the police, whereas individual terrorists who remove ministers and governors are truly elusive. Quick comment there, Lenin often wrote against and talked about the embrace of terrorism by the Narodniks, the old populists, and their descendants, such as the Social Revolutionary Party, so that's what he's talking about here. Continuing, the new step by the executive board of the manufacturer's henchmen affords us still another useful lesson. This lesson is that we must be able to make practical use of any liberalism, even of the two-penny, half-penny variety, and that at the same time we must be on our guard lest this liberalism corrupt the masses with its false presentation of questions. An example is Mr. Struve, an interview with whom we could put under the heading, How the Liberals Want to Teach the Workers and How the Workers Should Teach the Liberals. In number 4 of Osvobojdenia, which has begun publication of the memorandum under analysis, Mr. Struve tells us, among other things, that the new draft is an expression of, quote, statesmanship, which, he says, will scarcely succeed in breaking through the wall of arbitrariness and senselessness. No, Mr. Struve. It was not statesmanship that advanced the new strike bill, but the manufacturers. This bill has appeared not because the state recognized the basic principles of state law, the bourgeois liberty and equality of employers and workers, but because the abolition of criminal liability for participation in strikes has become advantageous to the manufacturers. The juridical formulations and wholly conclusive reasons now assigned by the Ministry of Finance itself existed long ago in Russian publications and even in the reports of government commissions, but it all remained buried in oblivion until the captains of industry raised their voices, after the workers had shown them in practice how absurd the old laws were. We stress the decisive importance of the manufacturers' advantages and interests, not because we believe that this diminishes the importance of the government schemes. On the contrary, we've already stated that this raises their importance in our eyes. But the proletariat must learn, above all, to look at things squarely and soberly in its struggle against the whole of the present-day system, to lay bare the real causes behind, quote, lofty acts of state, and to expose unremittingly the false and high-sounding bombast about statesmanship, etc., to which the sly police officials give utterance deliberately, and the learned liberals short-sightedly. Further, Mr. Struve advises the workers to be, quote, restrained in their agitation for the abolition of criminal liability for participation in strikes. Quote, the more restrained this agitation, will be in form, Mr. Struve preaches, the greater its significance will be. Unquote. The workers should cordially thank this former socialist for such advice. This is the traditional Malkalin wisdom of the liberals, to preach restraint at the very time when the government has just begun to waver on some particular question. Footnote, the Malkalin was a character in Griboyedov's play, Wit works woe, a careerist in Lickspittle. Continuing, more restraint is needed so as not to hinder implementation of the incipient reform, so as not to raise apprehensions, and to make use of the propitious moment when the first step has already been taken, a memorandum has been drawn up, and when some government department's recognition of the necessity for reforms becomes, quote, irrefutable proof both to the government and to society of the justice and timeliness, unquote, of these reforms. This is how Mr. Struve reasons with regard to the draft under discussion, and this is how the Russian liberals have always reasoned. However, this is not how the Social Democrats reason. Just look, they say. Even some manufacturers have already begun to understand that the European forms of the class struggle are better than Asiatic police tyranny. Our stubborn fight has forced even the manufacturers to doubt the omnipotence of the myrmidons of the autocracy. Forward then, more boldly. Spread more widely the glad tidings of irresolution in the enemy camp. Take advantage of the slightest sign of wavering on the part of the enemy so as to increase your demands rather than restrain them in the Mulholland manner. Against the debt the government owes to the people, they want to pay you 1 kopeck for every 100 rubles. Use payment of this kopeck in order to demand in louder and louder terms the whole sum, to completely discredit the government and prepare our forces to deliver a decisive blow at it. And that is the end of the audiobook. So,
Please like, share, and subscribe. See you.